welcome to my video. Medieval justice was brutal and bizarre. From public humiliations to shocking executions, people faced punishments you won't believe existed. In this video, we explore the strangest and most terrifying punishments from medieval times. The most bizarre punishments from medieval times. In the dim torchlight of a medieval town, the world seemed smaller, yet infinitely harsher than the one we know today. Narrow cobblestone streets carried the smells of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke of blacksmiths hammering steel. Merchants hawked their wares under timbered roofs, children darted between wagons, and in the center of the town square stood the one structure that drew the eyes of all, the wooden scaffold. It was a place both feared and necessary, a reminder that justice in those days was not a matter of careful debate or balanced laws, but a spectacle, harsh, unyielding, and designed to burn itself into the memory of every witness. For people of the Middle Ages, crime was not merely an offense against another person. It was considered an insult to God, a disruption to the divine order that ruled the universe. To sin against man was to sin against heaven, and so the punishment had to be terrible enough to cleanse both body and soul. Kings, lords, and magistrates all understood that fear was their most potent weapon. If one man stole a loaf of bread, he might be forgiven in silence. But if 10 men believed theft could go unpunished, chaos would spread like fire through a dry field. Thus, punishments had to be more than penalties, they had to be theater. And what a gruesome theater it often was. The townsfolk gathered eagerly when the bell tolled for judgment. These events were as much entertainment as they were warnings, and people crowded with the same anticipation as they would for a fair or a jousting tournament. Children, wide-eyed and clutching their mothers' skirts, learned early that justice was not gentle. Even the innocent were made to watch, for the spectacle was meant to shape society itself. The scaffold was both classroom and pulpit, and its lessons were written in blood. Among the first and most common punishments was the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, placed prominently in the marketplace. To our modern eyes, it might seem a mere humiliation, but in its time it was a dreadful fate. Imagine the bitter cold wind pressing against your cheeks as you stand immobilized, unable to wipe away sweat or tears, while villagers throw rotten vegetables, refuse, and even stones at you. Some mocked, others spat, and a few would strike hard enough to draw blood. To be locked in the pillory was not only a matter of pain, but of public shame, for reputation was as vital as bread. A man once dishonored might never do business again. A woman displayed in such a manner might find her prospects ruined forever. But the pillory was only the beginning. Far more bizarre punishments awaited those who transgressed against the laws of their lords. Take for instance the practice of the drunkard's cloak. In an age when ale flowed more freely than water, drunkenness was a common problem, and the authorities devised a punishment as humiliating as it was absurd. A large barrel was hollowed out, a hole cut in the top for the offender's head, and smaller openings carved for his arms. Forced into this ungainly outfit, the drunkard would stumble about the town, mocked by laughing children and jeering neighbors. The weight of the barrel made walking nearly impossible, and so the poor soul would stagger and fall, his shame amplified by his clumsy struggle. The punishment was not meant to maim, but to ridicule, to make an example of foolishness so that others would restrain themselves before drowning too deeply in the tavern's cask. The imagery of such punishments reveals a strange duality of medieval justice. They were cruel but also theatrical, almost comedic in their inventiveness. The people of the Middle Ages lived with a grim familiarity with death and suffering, and yet they also found entertainment in the ridiculousness of certain penalties. It was a world in which horror and humor often walked hand in hand. More severe crimes, however, demanded more than barrels and pillories. When the crime was treason, or an insult against the sovereign himself, no punishment could be too severe. Treason was the ultimate betrayal, not merely against the crown but against God's appointed ruler on earth. And so traitors were given the most infamous punishment of all, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This gruesome process was not only designed to kill but to annihilate, to strip away dignity and even the memory of the offender. The condemned would first be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, pulled by horses so that all might see his humiliation. Then at the scaffold he would be hanged, but not until death claimed him. Instead, the rope would be cut short of suffocation, leaving the body writhing and gasping. Next came the drawing, the belly split open, the entrails pulled forth and burned before the victim's fading eyes. Only then would the quartering come, as the body was hacked into pieces, each limb sent to different corners of the kingdom as a warning. To witness such a punishment was to feel the weight of fear pressed into one's bones. It was not justice, it was terror, carefully crafted to remind all subjects that loyalty was the highest law. Yet not all punishments were so final. Some were strange measures of correction, blending superstition with cruelty. In Germany and parts of England, quarrelsome wives were subjected to the scold's bridle, a device of iron fashioned to fit over the head, with a spiked plate pressing down upon the tongue. Once locked in place, it rendered the woman unable to speak without piercing her own flesh. She was then paraded through the town, her silence serving as proof that her sharp words had been tamed by the hand of justice. To modern eyes, it appears barbaric, a grotesque tool of patriarchal control. But in those days it was seen as necessary, a way to restore harmony to households where discord threatened the community's peace. The fascination of medieval punishments lies not only in their brutality but in their inventiveness. They reflect a society both deeply religious and profoundly theatrical, where every punishment was a sermon as much as a penalty. The marketplace became a stage, the townsfolk an audience, and the condemned the unwilling actors in a play that reinforced the values of obedience, faith, and order. To wander through a medieval town was to walk in constant awareness of these lessons. The very architecture reminded one of the reach of justice. The stocks by the churchyard, the gallows on the hill, the iron cages hanging from city gates where the corpses of criminals swung as food for crows. Even in death, punishment lingered, for the body itself was a message. To desecrate the corpse was to deny the offender the peace of burial, to cut him off from the hope of resurrection. Thus, medieval punishment did not end with breath, it reached into eternity. And yet, amidst this harsh world, one must remember the context. These punishments were not devised by monsters but by men and women who believed deeply in a cosmic order. Disease, famine, and war stalked their lives daily. Death came swiftly and often without reason. To them, justice had to be visible, dramatic, and terrifying enough to bind society together. Without it, they feared chaos would reign. And so, bizarre though their punishments may seem, they were, in their own way, an attempt to hold back the darkness. The medieval world was a world of contrasts, of faith and fear, cruelty and compassion, laughter and sorrow. Its punishments may appall us, but they tell us much about the people who endured them, their anxieties, their beliefs, and their determination to make sense of a perilous existence. To study them is to glimpse not only the barbarity of the past but also its desperate humanity, for beneath every punishment lay the same truth, the longing for order in a world forever teetering on the edge of chaos. The medieval mind was steeped in faith, so much so that every breath seemed tethered to God's will. To live was to walk beneath the gaze of heaven, and to die was to fall into the hands of eternal judgment. It is no surprise then that punishment in this age was not merely about justice. It was about salvation, about purging sin from the soul and reaffirming divine order in a world that seemed forever threatened by chaos and damnation. And so the punishments reserved for crimes against the faith or even suspected crimes were among the most bizarre and terrible of all. One of the most haunting practices of this era was the trial by ordeal. Today we place our trust in judges, juries, and laws, but in the Middle Ages, men and women often entrusted their fate directly to God, believing He would reveal the truth through fire, water, or iron. To be accused of a crime was not always to face evidence or witnesses. Sometimes, it was to face the hand of providence itself. In one version of the ordeal, the accused would be required to plunge a hand into boiling water or grasp a bar of red-hot iron. The wound would then be bound, and after several days the bandages would be removed. If the flesh had healed cleanly, God had declared the person innocent. But if the wound festered, if the flesh rotted with infection, then guilt was confirmed and punishment followed. Imagine the sheer terror of such a trial, the sizzle of flesh, the searing pain of iron, and the long, agonizing wait to learn whether divine mercy would appear as smooth skin or the curse of a festering wound. For many, the ordeal itself was already a sentence, regardless of its outcome. The ordeal by water carried its own strange logic. In cases of witchcraft or heresy, the accused might be bound hand and foot and cast into a river or pond. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent, tragic martyrs of a false accusation. If they floated, however, it was taken as proof that the water, pure and blessed by God, had rejected their sinful flesh. To float was to mark oneself as guilty. Thus, survival meant condemnation. The irony was brutal. Innocence could cost you your life, and guilt might leave you gasping in chains, awaiting the stake. Such rituals were not mere superstition. They were woven into the very fabric of medieval law and belief. People genuinely trusted that God would intervene, that His will would shine through the water's ripples or the healing of a burn. To them, the ordeal was not cruelty, it was divine justice made visible. It gave structure to a world where evidence was scarce, and suspicion was often enough to condemn. But nowhere was the fury of faith more terrifying than in the punishment of heresy. To question the Church was to question the foundation of society itself, for the Church was not merely a religious body, it was the very heart of order, morality, and authority. Heretics were seen not as mere dissenters but as cancers eating away at the soul of Christendom. And so, the punishment was fire. The burning stake rose like a grim altar in town squares and fields. On market days, when crowds already thronged the streets, heretics were marched through the jeering mob, sometimes carrying the very wood that would fuel their destruction. The smell of pitch and resin filled the air as executioners bound them to the post. A hush might fall as prayers were muttered, some begging the condemned to recant, others demanding swift vengeance. Then, with the torch's kiss, flames leapt upward, devouring cloth and flesh, the smoke spiraling heavenward as if to deliver the soul itself for judgment. The burning was more than punishment, it was spectacle, a public sermon of fire and ash. It told every witness, this is what awaits those who defy the faith. And though we might recoil from its cruelty, it must be remembered that the medieval mind saw mercy even in flame. The fire was believed to purify, to burn away sin so that the soul might yet find redemption. To perish in agony was, paradoxically, to be offered salvation. The Inquisition formalized this terrible theater. Its courts spread across Europe, hunting those suspected of secret heresies, Cathars, Waldensians, witches, or merely those whose neighbors whispered against them. The accused were questioned, sometimes coaxed, often tortured, until confession was wrung from trembling lips. Torture itself was justified as a tool not of cruelty but of truth. The logic was that the body might be broken to save the soul, and the confession, whether true or not, became the key to salvation. Among the stranger punishments handed down by ecclesiastical courts was the practice of penance through pilgrimage. A convicted heretic or blasphemer might be ordered to walk barefoot to a distant shrine, clothed in rags, bearing a cross upon his back. Along the way, villagers could jeer, spit, or strike, treating him as a living warning. The journey was both punishment and prayer, a hope that the long suffering of the road might erase the sin that threatened eternal damnation. To the medieval imagination, distance and pain were themselves sacred tools of purification. And yet, not all religious punishments ended in death or blood. Some were bizarrely symbolic, designed to humiliate the sinner while sparing their body. A monk who had broken his vows might be forced to eat his meals lying on the cold floor while his brothers dined at table, his shame as sharp as any lash. A parishioner guilty of gossip or blasphemy might be made to stand at the church door during Mass, wearing a sackcloth garment, holding a candle nearly as tall as himself, while neighbors passed by with disapproving glances. These punishments were subtle but cutting, for honor and reputation were lifeblood in medieval towns. To be shamed before one's community was often worse than physical pain. Still, the fire remained the ultimate expression of divine punishment on earth. The image of a heretic in flames burned itself into the collective imagination of the age. Chroniclers described the cries, the twisting forms silhouetted against the night, the acrid smoke rising like a dark offering. Children remembered the sight long into adulthood, retelling it as a warning to their own children. In this way, the spectacle perpetuated itself, each generation inheriting not only the fear but also the belief in its necessity. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these punishments was their sincerity. Unlike modern cruelty, which is often disguised beneath excuses of pragmatism or efficiency, medieval punishments for heresy were wrapped in the language of salvation. Judges and priests truly believed they were saving souls, even as they tied the knots and lit the fires. It is this sincerity that chills us most, for it reveals a world in which compassion and cruelty were intertwined, where mercy could wear the mask of flame. The reliance on ordeals and fiery justice reveals something profound about the medieval mind, an unshakable conviction that God was not distant but intimately involved in every human affair. If the accused drowned, it was God's will. If they floated, it was God's will. If the flesh healed, God had spoken. If it rotted, God had spoken still. There was no randomness, no accident, only divine judgment read in the wounds of flesh and the smoke of fire. To live in such a world was to live with constant awareness of judgment, both earthly and heavenly, a judgment that could strike suddenly and bizarrely at any moment. The punishments of faith were among the strangest and most dreadful of the medieval world. They bound together fear and belief, cruelty and hope, pain and salvation. And they remind us that the Middle Ages were not simply brutal for brutality's sake, but brutal in pursuit of meaning, in the desperate attempt to reconcile earthly justice with eternal destiny. To us, their punishments appear bizarre. To them they were sacred theater, the very balance of the cosmos acted out upon the trembling bodies of the accused. If fire was the weapon of faith and iron the tool of kings, then laughter, sharp, mocking and merciless, was the punishment wielded by the people themselves. In the Middle Ages, reputation was everything. A man's honor was his currency, a woman's modesty her shield. To lose one's good name was to become an outcast, a shadow moving through streets where every eye turned in judgment. And so, medieval authorities often turned to humiliation as a weapon far more enduring than the lash. Pain might fade, but shame lingered, whispered and remembered long after wounds had healed. In many towns, one could hear the creak of wood and the splash of water as offenders were subjected to the cucking stool, a contraption reserved most often for women accused of scolding, gossip, or disorderly conduct. It was a simple device, a sturdy chair mounted upon a long beam, balanced so that the condemned could be dunked again and again into the nearest pond or river. Onlookers gathered along the banks, laughing as the unfortunate woman sputtered and gasped, her skirts clinging to her in sodden humiliation. The punishment was not designed to drown but to degrade, to transform the act of correction into public theater. The ripples on the water carried her shame as far as the laughter carried her disgrace. But humiliation took many forms, some carved in iron, others stitched in cloth. The shame mask, also called the brank, was a cruel invention that turned the offender into a living symbol of ridicule. Forged from iron and shaped like grotesque animal faces, snouts, donkey ears or long tongues, the mask was locked onto the head of the guilty. A woman accused of lying might be forced to wear a mask with a long metal tongue jutting outward. A man guilty of foolishness might wear the ears of an ass. The weight pressed down upon the skull, the metal chafed the skin, and every passerby saw not a human being but a walking joke, condemned to embody his sin. Some masks even contained spikes that pressed into the tongue or cheeks, ensuring silence. To wear one was agony, but worse than the pain was the laughter, the mocking crowds, the pointing fingers, the endless jeers that cut deeper than any blade. In the narrow streets of medieval towns, humiliation was not confined to the scaffold. Sometimes it was carried through the very heart of the community in the form of processions. Offenders might be forced to parade barefoot, carrying heavy stones or wearing absurd costumes that marked their guilt. A thief might be draped in chains, each clanking step a reminder of bondage. An adulterer could be forced to wear clothing inside out, his shame displayed in every stitch. Whole communities turned out for these processions, their laughter a chorus that echoed down alleys and across market squares. Particularly infamous was the practice of chivalry, a kind of mock parade reserved for those whose behavior offended the community's sense of order, especially in matters of marriage. If a man was thought weak before his wife, or if a widow remarried too quickly, neighbors might gather at night with pots, pans and horns. They would swarm the offender's house, banging and clattering in a cacophony of scorn, dragging the guilty into the street for all to see. Sometimes effigies were paraded, wooden figures representing the offender, beaten and mocked before being set aflame. Other times the people themselves were forced to ride backward on donkeys, their faces blackened with soot, while the mob howled around them. It was a punishment not handed down by kings or priests, but by the community itself, a raw expression of collective judgment. The ingenuity of humiliation seemed endless. In some towns, dishonest bakers, those who sold bread lighter than the standard weight, were forced to carry their fraudulent loaves around their necks, or worse, to be tied to a cart and dragged through the marketplace with their underweight bread displayed for all to see. Fornication, drunkenness, slander, and even laziness could all summon the lash of mockery. To be laughed at in the Middle Ages was no small thing. It was to be stripped of dignity, to be rendered powerless in a society where one's standing meant survival. The punishments could even follow a person into the church, the very heart of spiritual life. Imagine kneeling at the door of the parish in sackcloth, holding a candle as long as one's body, while neighbors streamed past into mass. Every whispered prayer became a reminder of your fall, every bowed head a reflection of your disgrace. To sit in the place of penance, separated from the congregation, was to bear a mark as visible as any brand. Even God's house became a theater of shame. What makes these punishments so bizarre is not merely their cruelty but their creativity. Pain was one thing, ridicule another. The pillory, for example, was not only a place of confinement but a stage upon which the people could invent their own torments. Villagers hurled rotten eggs, mud, and dung at the immobilized offender. Some brought dead animals, others sharp stones. Children were encouraged to jeer, their laughter weaving them into the fabric of communal justice. The punishment became an event, a holiday of scorn where cruelty was wrapped in festivity. In some places, offenders were forced into clothing that symbolized their crime. A woman accused of adultery might be dressed in garments dyed half white and half black, signifying betrayal and deceit. A gambler could be draped with cards and dice strung around his neck. These punishments were walking sermons, reminders to all who saw them of the dangers of vice. Unlike the gallows, which ended a life, or the stake, which consumed a body, these punishments lived on in memory, replayed in gossip and laughter long after the offender's ordeal had ended. The effectiveness of humiliation lay in its reach. A whipping scar might be hidden beneath clothing, but shame walked beside you, clinging to your name and reputation. The medieval world was a small one. Villages were close-knit, towns crowded. Everyone knew everyone else, and gossip spread faster than fire in a thatched roof. To be humiliated was to carry a burden that might never fade. Even when the punishment ended, its echo remained in whispers, in side glances, in the lingering smirk of a neighbor. And yet, one must not mistake humiliation as mere cruelty. It had a purpose in the medieval mind: to restore balance, to correct behavior, to teach lessons that words alone could not. The woman who scolded too loudly, the man who shirked his duties, the youth who mocked authority, each was reminded, through humiliation, of the boundaries that held society together. Laughter became law, mockery became justice, and shame itself became a prison more lasting than any wall of stone. There is something deeply unsettling in this mingling of cruelty and comedy. The punishments of humiliation were carnivals of suffering, where neighbors joined hands not in compassion but in ridicule. They laughed together, and in laughing affirmed their unity, their shared values, their common disdain for the one who had transgressed. In this way, humiliation was both punishment and glue, binding the community together by casting out the offender. To modernize, the idea of dunking stools and shame masks may seem absurd, almost cartoonish. But for those who endured them, they were devastating. A woman emerging dripping from the river, her hair plastered to her face, her dignity shattered by laughter, might never again find her place in society. A man forced to wear the mask of an ass might never recover the respect of his peers. These punishments destroyed reputations, and in a world where honor was survival, that destruction could be as final as death. And so, the theater of humiliation joined the arsenal of medieval justice, standing alongside fire, iron, and rope. It was less bloody, less final, but no less cruel in its power. In laughter, the people found their weapon. In shame, they found their warning. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of that laughter still ring uncomfortably in our ears, a reminder that cruelty often hides behind a smile, and that ridicule can cut deeper than any blade. In the medieval imagination, the human body was not merely flesh and bone. It was a vessel of the soul, a living manuscript upon which justice could be inscribed. To harm the body was to leave a visible testimony, a scar that told the story of sin and punishment long after the moment of judgment had passed. Where humiliation mocked and fire consumed, bodily punishments etched themselves into living skin, turning men and women into walking reminders of the authority they had defied. Pain was temporary, but scars endured, and in a world without anonymity, every mark was a proclamation of guilt. Whipping was the most common of these punishments, the crack of leather on flesh echoing through countless marketplaces and castle courtyards. It was swift, public, and devastatingly effective. Stripped to the waist, the offender was tied to a post or tree, his back bared for the lash. The whip, often tipped with knots or bits of iron, tore into the skin, each stroke a fiery line of agony. Spectators gathered not merely to watch but to count, each lash punctuated by gasps, jeers, or prayers. Blood spattered the earth, sweat stung open wounds, and the cries of the condemned rose like a grim liturgy. Whipping was punishment, spectacle, and sermon all at once, its lesson engraved not only on the back of the offender but on the minds of all who watched. Yet, the whip was merciful compared to branding, a punishment that transformed flesh into parchment. Branding irons, heated in roaring fires until they glowed red, were pressed against the skin, searing letters or symbols that declared the crime for all to see. A thief might carry the letter T on his cheek or hand, a blasphemer, a mark upon the lip or tongue. Some were branded upon the forehead, an inescapable stamp of disgrace that even time could not erase. The stench of burning flesh filled the air as the iron hissed, the victim's screams mingling with the sizzle. And when the wound healed, it left behind not only a scar but a living reminder, an eternal punishment carried wherever the condemned went. Branding was particularly feared because it denied the possibility of hiding one's past. In a society where honor was essential and forgiveness rare, a branded man was an outcast. He might find no work, no welcome, no mercy. The mark transformed him into a permanent criminal, even if his crime had been small. To be branded was to be exiled in plain sight, to live among people who could never forget, never allow redemption. Other punishments went further still, mutilating the body to prevent future crime. Thieves, for example, often lost a hand, the very instrument of their transgression. The ritual was deliberate, the hand laid upon a block, the axe falling swift and final. Blood gushed, screams pierced the air, and the severed hand was sometimes nailed to a post or displayed as warning. A liar might have his tongue cut out, a forger his fingers severed, an adulterer his nose sliced away. The medieval belief was simple: remove the tool of sin, and you remove the temptation. But these punishments also ensured lifelong shame, for the mutilated body became a map of guilt, visible to all. The punishment of cropping the ears was particularly notorious. Ears, being both visible and symbolic of listening, were often sliced off to mark disobedience or treachery. The bloody stumps left behind could not be hidden, branding the offender as an object of scorn. In some cases, the ears were nailed to a wooden post, forcing the condemned to tear themselves free, leaving ragged wounds as proof of their disgrace. The brutality was matched only by its message: once punished, you were never the same again. For certain crimes, especially those against authority, punishments grew even more grotesque. Tongues were torn out with iron pincers, ensuring that slander or blasphemy would never pass those lips again. In some towns, blasphemers had their mouths burned with hot irons or scalding water, the very organ of offense destroyed in the name of justice. These were not punishments meant to correct but to silence forever, to erase the possibility of repetition through mutilation. The body itself was sometimes twisted into an emblem of shame. In France and Germany, dishonest merchants were forced to kneel in chains while their fraudulent goods were destroyed before their eyes, their hands scarred or broken to prevent further deceit. In England, poachers might be blinded, ensuring they could never again take what was not theirs. The punishment did not always kill, but it ensured that life afterward was lived in misery and dependence, a constant reminder that the hand of authority reached into every corner of existence. Beyond mutilation, there were punishments designed to torment the body in strange and theatrical ways. Some offenders were placed in iron cages, small, confining structures hung from city gates or gallows poles. The body, trapped in a posture of agony, became a public exhibit. Food and water were withheld, and the condemned slowly wasted away while birds pecked at their flesh. The cage became both tomb and warning, a grotesque ornament reminding travelers of the price of sin. The rack, though more often associated with interrogation, sometimes served as punishment in its own right. Stretched until joints popped and muscles tore, the victim's body was transformed into a spectacle of suffering. To see a man broken on the rack was to witness both his pain and the authority of those who commanded it. Even when released, the victim was often left crippled, his twisted body a permanent display of justice. What is striking about these punishments is the way they merged practicality with symbolism. Cutting off a thief's hand prevented further theft, but it also turned his body into a visible warning. Branding burned the crime into the flesh, making repentance irrelevant. Cropping ears or tearing tongues silenced defiance both literally and figuratively. The medieval mind saw no separation between body and soul. To scar the flesh was to scar the spirit, to etch justice not only into the world but into eternity. And yet, amidst the horror there was always spectacle. These punishments were rarely carried out in private. Instead, they were performed in marketplaces, on bridges, at crossroads, places where the maximum number of people could witness them. Children learned the sight of justice early, merchants paused their trade to watch, peasants whispered the stories for generations. The body became a stage and pain the performance, all in the service of order. The cruelty of bodily punishments reflected both fear and necessity. In a world where prisons were few and costly, and where kings and lords lacked the resources to confine offenders for long periods, the body itself became the prison, scarred and broken into obedience. A scar needed no guards. A missing hand required no chains. A branded forehead demanded no overseer, for society itself became the jailer, enforcing justice with every glance, every whisper, every shun. And yet, it is easy to imagine the terror these punishments inspired. To live under the constant possibility of losing a limb, an ear, or one's very tongue was to walk daily in fear. A careless insult, a desperate theft, a whispered rumor could end in mutilation that would haunt a lifetime. The medieval body was not truly one's own, it belonged also to the law, to the church, to the crown. And when transgression occurred, the body was taken, cut, burned, or broken to remind all that order reigned supreme. The spectacle of flesh and pain tells us much about the medieval worldview. To them, justice had to be visible, undeniable, and unforgettable. Words could be forgotten, fines ignored, prisons escaped. But a missing hand, a branded face, a mutilated tongue, these were punishments that followed a man to his grave. In flesh, the law found permanence. In scars, society found memory. And so, the body became a canvas of justice, painted in fire and iron, a living testament to the bizarre and brutal creativity of medieval punishment. Death was never far in the medieval world. Famine stalked the countryside, plague swept through villages, and war left corpses piled in fields. Yet despite the nearness of mortality, execution stood apart. It was not the quiet slipping away of sickness or the anonymous fall of soldiers in battle. It was deliberate, staged, and terrifyingly personal. It was death transformed into theater, where the condemned body became the stage upon which law and vengeance performed their final act. And of all punishments in the Middle Ages, the executions designed to break not just life but spirit were the most bizarre, the most grotesque, and the most unforgettable. Foremost among these was the dreaded breaking wheel, a punishment that blended brutality with ritual. The wheel itself was a massive wooden cartwheel, often reinforced with iron, laid flat upon the ground or raised on a frame. The condemned was bound to it, arms and legs spread wide like a grotesque star. Then, with deliberate precision, the executioner brought down an iron cudgel upon each limb, shattering bones one by one. The crack of splintering bone echoed across the square, mingling with the cries of the dying man. His body twisted unnaturally, his limbs broken into useless angles, until at last he was woven into the wheel itself, his ruined form threaded between its spokes like some monstrous tapestry. But death was rarely swift. The condemned might linger for hours, even days, exposed to the sun and cold, birds circling above to feast upon his flesh. Families, children, and travelers all witnessed the spectacle, for the wheel was raised high upon poles or hillsides so that none could ignore it. The body became a warning etched against the sky. Disobedience ends in ruin, betrayal, and agony. The wheel was more than execution. It was a monument to fear, its shadow stretching across every heart. If the wheel shattered bones, boiling alive seared flesh in ways no imagination could soften. Reserved for the gravest crimes, such as poisoning, considered the most insidious of murders, this punishment was as gruesome as it was theatrical. A cauldron of water, oil, or even molten metal was prepared in the marketplace, the fire stoked until the liquid hissed and bubbled. Then the condemned was lowered slowly into the cauldron, so that the crowd could savor every scream, every convulsion, every frantic struggle. The hiss of flesh meeting liquid was a sound that haunted all who heard it, an unholy sizzle that spoke of judgment more terrible than words. Unlike hanging or beheading, boiling offered no quick escape. It was agony stretched across minutes, a drawn-out suffering that etched itself into memory. Some chroniclers claim that in England, under the reign of Henry VIII, poisoners were sentenced to this fate, their bodies writhing as the steam rose into the air. The punishment was meant to be as unnatural as the crime itself. A murderer who had killed in secret, without honor, was given a death both spectacular and dishonorable, burned alive before the eyes of all. Even more shocking, though, was the punishment of sawing. Rare in Western Europe but more frequent in parts of Central and Eastern lands, this method embodied sheer cruelty. The condemned was hung upside down, legs spread wide, while executioners set a great saw to the groin and began their grisly work. Gravity ensured that blood flowed downward, keeping the victim conscious for far longer than nature should allow. The saw bit through bone and sinew inch by inch, the body convulsing with every pull of the blade. Some accounts insist that the condemned remained alive until the saw reached the chest, their cries echoing into the horrified silence of the crowd. The very horror of sawing was part of its purpose. It was not a punishment for petty theft or insult, but for crimes seen as monstrous, treason, sacrilege, or unspeakable betrayal. To be sawn in two was to be erased, cut apart not only in flesh but in memory, transformed into a warning that shuddered through generations. Even to whisper the word sawing was to invoke dread. The list of bizarre deaths seems endless, each more dreadful than the last. Take for instance the punishment of flaying, in which the skin was stripped from the body of the condemned, often while still alive. Executioners began at the legs or torso, peeling flesh away like the hide of an animal, while the victim's screams pierced the heavens. The flayed skin might then be nailed to city gates or stretched across church doors, a gruesome banner of justice. To flay a man was to annihilate him, to erase not only life but identity, leaving behind only the raw red truth of mortality. Even animals were sometimes subjected to this grim theater. Records tell of pigs tried and executed for killing children, their bodies dressed in human clothes before being hanged or burned. The logic was clear to the medieval mind. Punishment had to be seen, no matter the offender, so that society itself was reassured that justice ruled over all creation. To us it seems absurd, to them it was part of the cosmic order. Yet, perhaps no death was so simultaneously terrifying and symbolic as immurement, the punishment of being walled up alive. The condemned, often nuns accused of breaking vows or clerics guilty of heresy, were sealed inside small stone cells, bricked in with only a tiny hole through which food and water might be passed. Some cells had no holes at all, condemning the guilty to suffocate in darkness, their cries muffled by stone. Days passed, then silence. And the wall itself became their tomb, a permanent reminder built into the very architecture of town or monastery. To walk past such a wall was to walk past a graveyard of sin. Other punishments reveled in sheer spectacle. Executioners in some regions practiced the dance of swords, slicing away pieces of flesh before delivering the final blow. In Germany, criminals might be broken on the wheel not with immediate strikes but with slow, deliberate blows, each one spaced apart to prolong suffering. In Italy, rebels were hurled from tall towers, their bodies dashed to pieces on the cobblestones below. Each culture devised its own theater of death, blending cruelty with symbolism, terror with ceremony. To modern minds, it may seem unthinkable that crowds gathered eagerly for such horrors. Yet in the Middle Ages, executions were not only punishments. They were lessons, rituals of reassurance in a world ruled by uncertainty. To see a traitor broken on the wheel was to know that order still held, that the chaos of rebellion had been crushed. To watch a poisoner boil was to affirm that evil done in secret would meet its answer in public. To witness the sawing of a body was to see, in flesh and blood, the triumph of authority over sin. And so, death became spectacle, suffering became sermon. Children sat upon their fathers' shoulders to watch, mothers brought infants to witness, merchants paused their trade to crowd the square. Chroniclers recorded not only the deaths but the reactions of the people, the gasps, the cheers, the prayers. Executions were woven into the very rhythm of life, their grotesque pageantry as much a part of the calendar as feast days and festivals. Yet even in this darkness, there is a strange glimmer of humanity. The executioner himself was often seen as a necessary evil, a man who bore society's sin by wielding its sword. He lived on the edges of respectability, feared and shunned, yet vital. His craft was not only to kill but to perform, to time the blows, to manage the spectacle. And sometimes, in rare moments, he was merciful, striking quickly to shorten suffering, turning horror into sudden silence. But more often, his duty was to prolong, to make the punishment as memorable as possible, for memory was the true purpose of medieval death. The bizarre executions of the Middle Ages remind us not only of cruelty but of a deep need for order. They were tools of fear in a world forever teetering between faith and chaos, discipline and rebellion. To see them as mere barbarity is to miss their meaning. They were rituals of control, plays performed upon the ultimate stage of the human body. And while the actors perished, the audience carried the lesson home, whispering it for generations. The law is strong, the crown is merciless, and death is the final warning. Medieval justice did not claim to be blind. Far from it, the punishments of the age often depended not only on the crime but on who committed it. A nobleman and a peasant might be sentenced differently for the same offense. A priest might face the judgment of the church rather than the king, and a woman could be punished in ways that reflected her role, or lack thereof, within the rigid structures of society. To step into the world of medieval punishments is to see justice bent to the shape of power, gender, and even species. The spectacle of cruelty was not uniform. It was tailored, sharpened, and staged differently for women, children, and even the beasts that lived alongside mankind. Among the most notorious punishments reserved for women was the ducking stool, a contraption designed less to kill than to humiliate. At first glance, it looked like something from a rustic fairground, a heavy wooden chair attached to a long beam, set upon a pivot. But its purpose was anything but innocent. A woman accused of gossip, scolding, or suspected of witchcraft would be strapped to the chair and swung over a river or pond. Then, with the jeering of neighbors ringing in her ears, she would be dunked into the cold, filthy water, held under until near drowning, then hauled back up sputtering and gasping, only to be plunged again. The punishment was as much theater as torment. Crowds gathered eagerly along the banks, laughing and shouting insults as the accused bobbed up and down like some grotesque puppet. In an age where women were often seen as the guardians, or betrayers, of household harmony, gossip was considered more than idle chatter. It was a threat to the peace of the community. The ducking stool offered a public cleansing of sorts, a violent washing away of discord. Yet, beneath its cruel humor lay something darker: the need to control female voices, to punish not just crime but the audacity of speaking too freely. Another device aimed at silencing women was the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. This punishment was cruel in its simplicity: a metal cage fitted over a woman's head, with an iron bit that pressed down upon her tongue. Sometimes the bit was studded with spikes, ensuring that even the slightest movement of the tongue tore at the flesh. The woman, muzzled like a beast, was paraded through the streets for all to see. Her silence became a public performance, her shame a lesson for every other woman watching. To wear the brank was to be reduced to voicelessness, stripped of humanity, made a symbol of submission by force of iron. But not all punishments for women were about silencing. Some were about branding. Adulteresses in certain places might be forced to wear conspicuous clothing, shaved heads, scarlet cloaks, or signs sewn into their garments declaring their sin. Others might be flogged naked through the streets, their bodies exposed as living texts upon which shame was written. The body became a canvas of punishment, a walking warning to others. And yet, it was not only women of low birth who faced these humiliations. Even noble women could be subjected to public disgrace, though their rank sometimes shielded them from the harshest torments. Still, the lesson was clear: the female body belonged not to the woman alone but to the community, and if she transgressed, the community would mark her for it. Children too were not spared the iron hand of medieval justice. Though tender years might lessen the severity of punishment, the principle of correction was never absent. In schools, beatings were common, the rod seen as a necessary instrument of learning. A child who erred in reciting his Latin might feel the sting of a birch switch across his back. A girl who failed her domestic duties might be whipped with equal vigor. The medieval world held little faith in gentle instruction. To spare the rod was to spoil the child, and so the rod fell often and hard. In more serious cases, children were sometimes tried as adults, especially once they reached the age of 12, the age at which the law began to see them as morally responsible. A boy who stole from the market might find himself whipped at the cart's tail, dragged through town as neighbors jeered. In rare but chilling instances, children accused of grave crimes, such as arson or murder, faced the gallows. Chroniclers record with horror the sight of youths hanging alongside hardened criminals, their small bodies swaying in the wind. Yet to the medieval mind, crime demanded punishment regardless of age, and mercy was a luxury not always granted. Most bizarre of all, however, was the practice of putting animals on trial. The medieval world was alive with symbolism, and animals were seen not merely as beasts but as creatures bound into the same moral order as men. Thus, when a pig killed a child, or a rooster was accused of laying an egg, it was not enough to kill the beast quietly. No, the law demanded formality. Animals were arrested, imprisoned, tried before magistrates, and sentenced with all the solemnity afforded to humans. Pigs were the most common offenders, for they roamed freely in villages, often entering homes and biting infants left unattended. When such tragedies occurred, the pig was seized, dressed in human clothing and brought to court. Witnesses testified, judges deliberated, and the sentence was passed. Execution followed, often by hanging, the pig swinging from the gallows like any thief or murderer. The punishment served as both justice and warning, reinforcing the belief that the moral order encompassed all living things. Other animals suffered stranger fates. In France, a donkey accused of indecent behavior was once acquitted after villagers testified to its good character. In another case, swarms of insects were excommunicated by church authorities, condemned in solemn ceremony and banished from fields and vineyards. Such events might seem absurd to modern minds, but to the medieval world they made perfect sense. Sin and disorder were cosmic, and to restore balance, even animals had to face the rule of law. The punishments reserved for women, children, and animals reveal much about the anxieties of medieval society. Women were feared for their voices, their sexuality, their capacity to disrupt male authority. Children were seen as clay to be beaten into shape, their innocence no shield against harsh correction. Animals too were bound into the great chain of being, their actions judged as moral or immoral by the same standards applied to men. Justice was not uniform. It was tailored, twisted, and sharpened to strike at those who represented vulnerability, disorder, or danger in the communal imagination. Yet beneath the cruelty lay a strange coherence. The ducking stool and the brank sought not only to punish women but to assert the dominance of social order over personal will. The beatings of children were not only about pain but about shaping souls in a world where survival demanded discipline. And the trials of animals were not lunacy but ritual, a way of making sense of a universe where man and beast lived side by side, bound by unseen laws. Punishment was bizarre, yes, but it was also meaningful. An attempt to impose clarity on chaos, to draw lines in a world always teetering on the edge of disorder. To modern readers, the image of a woman dunked in filthy water for gossip, or a pig dressed in breeches and hanged, provokes disbelief, even laughter. But to those who lived then, these were serious matters, performed with solemnity and purpose. They remind us that justice is never merely about crime and penalty, it is about power, fear, and belief. And in the Middle Ages, those forces converged in punishments so strange, so cruel, and so unforgettable that they still haunt us centuries later. If there was one thing the medieval world understood, it was the power of the crowd. Justice was never meant to be a private affair. It was spectacle, theater, and ritual, designed not only to correct the wrongdoer but to remind every bystander of their own fragile place within the order of things. While executions shocked through terror, public humiliations worked through mockery. They turned criminals into living displays, objects of derision, laughter, and sometimes violence. These punishments were not about death or blood. They were about shame, about stripping dignity until only ridicule remained. The most famous instruments of humiliation were the stocks and the pillory, those wooden frames that stood in town squares like silent threats. The stocks were simple, heavy wooden boards with holes cut to trap the ankles of the condemned. The offender sat helpless on the ground, legs locked in place, often for hours or even days. The pillory was more elaborate, securing the head and hands in wooden holes so that the criminal stood bent forward, exposed, unable to move or defend themselves. Both were designed not only for restraint but for ridicule, inviting the community to gather, jeer, and participate in the punishment. The genius, or cruelty, of these devices lay in their passivity. The state did not have to lift a whip or draw blood. The people themselves became the executioners of shame. Crowds hurled rotten vegetables, mud, dead animals, or even human waste at the trapped offender. Children spat, merchants mocked, and neighbors shouted insults dredged from years of grievance. For petty theft, drunkenness, slander, or minor fraud, the pillory transformed the criminal into a living target, a magnet for scorn. Time slowed to agony as the condemned stood helpless, sweat dripping, body aching, face smeared with filth, while laughter rang louder than any lash. But humiliation was not confined to these wooden frames. Medieval justice delighted in turning punishment into a performance that involved the entire community. Offenders were often paraded through the streets, forced to carry symbols of their crime. A baker who cheated customers might be made to carry a loaf of bad bread on his head. A false witness might wear a sign declaring "perjurer" in bold letters. A dishonest merchant might be forced to wear counterfeit goods around his neck as evidence of fraud. These processions were noisy, chaotic affairs. Drums beat, bells rang, and children danced alongside, mocking and jeering. The streets themselves became the stage upon which disgrace was displayed. For women, humiliation took on particular forms. A wife accused of marital infidelity might be paraded naked through the marketplace, her hair shorn, her body marked with soot or ash. The community's gaze became a weapon sharper than any blade, stripping her not just of clothing but of social standing. In some villages, quarrelsome wives were forced to ride backward on donkeys, holding the tail instead of the reins, their awkward position sparking laughter from the crowd. The symbolism was clear. A woman who upset the balance of the household was inverted, turned upside down, mocked into submission. There were also punishments designed to ridicule professions. In parts of France, a fraudulent baker might be tied to a cart and dragged through town while his loaves were burned before him. A dishonest miller could be tumbled into his own millstream. The punishment fit the crime, not in scale but in symbolism. Justice was poetic, and its poetry was often cruelly comic. To see a baker smeared with dough or a tavern keeper drenched in sour ale was to laugh at sin and learn the lesson all at once. Humiliation extended beyond individuals to entire communities. When a town failed to pay taxes or committed some collective offense, it might be subjected to symbolic punishments. Forced to walk barefoot in procession to a cathedral, carrying candles in penance. Compelled to dismantle its own walls as a sign of submission, or made to host the soldiers of a king at its own expense, the humiliation written in empty granaries and drained purses. Even civic pride could be shamed, and the sting of disgrace burned long after wounds had healed. Yet, for all its cruelty, the theater of shame had its own strange sense of justice. Unlike execution, it offered survival. A man placed in the pillory might suffer bruises, broken bones, or festering wounds from the crowd's missiles, but if he endured, he returned to life. His shame might linger, but he was alive, and often the punishment's memory faded into a dark sort of comedy. Indeed, some criminals grew defiant under humiliation, staring back at the crowd with unbroken pride, transforming their disgrace into a spectacle of resistance. Chroniclers record instances where the crowd, rather than mocking, began to sympathize, turning jeers into cheers, undermining the punishment altogether. The pillory itself could become a paradox. In England, it endured for centuries, not only as a tool of punishment but as a place of protest. Writers and pamphleteers, punished for their words, often found themselves in the pillory, only to be greeted by sympathetic crowds who showered them with flowers instead of filth. The instrument meant to shame became, at times, a platform of defiance, its wooden frame transformed into a stage for martyrdom. Still, more often than not, humiliation left scars deeper than bruises. A man laughed at by his neighbors for cowardice or fraud carried that shame into every market transaction thereafter. A woman ridiculed for gossip found her voice distrusted long after the brank had been removed. A child who saw his father mocked in the stocks learned a lesson about disgrace that shaped him for life. Shame was not simply an emotion, it was a currency, one that marked bodies, reputations, and futures. The rituals of humiliation reveal a society obsessed with visibility. Crimes had to be seen, punishments had to be public, and disgrace had to be shared. The square, the marketplace, the church steps, all became theaters of morality. Silence and secrecy were the enemies of justice. Only through spectacle could order be affirmed. The laughter of the crowd, as cruel as it was also the sound of unity, a chorus declaring that sin had been named and punished, that the fabric of the community was intact once more. To us, the sight of a man locked in wooden boards while his neighbors throw garbage might seem barbaric, even absurd. But in the medieval world, it was a moral lesson written in flesh and ridicule. It was as important as sermons and as memorable as battles. The theater of shame was not an accident of cruelty, it was a deliberate, structured, and enduring part of medieval justice. Its echoes linger even today in our fascination with scandal, our appetite for public disgrace, and our unspoken belief that to be laughed at may, in the end, be worse than to be beaten. To understand punishment in the Middle Ages, one must first understand the soul. For medieval people, crime was not merely a wound to society, it was a wound to God's order. Every theft, every lie, every betrayal echoed beyond the earthly realm into eternity. The thief stole not only from his neighbor but from divine justice. The liar offended not only his victim but the truth itself, which belonged to God. It was this theology that turned punishment into more than discipline. Punishment became penance. It was not enough to pay a fine or to endure the lash. A criminal had to reconcile with heaven, and it was religion that often dictated the most bizarre, symbolic, and terrifying penalties. Some of these punishments were clothed in the language of mercy. Instead of whipping or death, an offender might be sentenced to pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, on the surface, seemed a holy journey, walking to a shrine, visiting the relics of a saint, seeking absolution at a sacred site. But in practice, pilgrimage as punishment was often grueling, humiliating, and dangerous. A thief might be forced to walk barefoot to Canterbury, his feet torn and bleeding on the road. A forger might be ordered to travel to Santiago de Compostela carrying chains as a sign of his bondage to sin. Some criminals were branded with badges or symbols to mark them as penitents, their shame visible at every stop along the way. Pilgrimage was exile in motion, a punishment that stretched across miles and months, leaving scars not only on the body but on the soul. For more severe sins, the church imposed public penance. Offenders stood barefoot outside the cathedral, clothed in sackcloth, sometimes with ashes sprinkled on their heads, waiting for worshippers to pass. They might be required to prostrate themselves before priests or crawl on hands and knees through the nave as the congregation watched. In monasteries, monks who broke their vows were made to lie flat upon the floor while brothers stepped over them on the way to prayer, a living bridge of humiliation. The act was symbolic. Sin was a weight to be trampled, pride to be crushed. And yet, in the silence of the church, the punishment burned with a shame as fierce as any lash. But when faith turned to fear, punishments darkened into horrors. The most dreaded of all religious penalties was excommunication, the cutting off of a soul from the body of Christ. Unlike flogging or imprisonment, excommunication struck at the heart of medieval existence. To be cast out of the church was to be cast out of salvation itself. It meant denial of the sacraments, exclusion from burial in consecrated ground, and isolation from the community of the faithful. Neighbors shunned the excommunicate, Friends dared not speak to him. Even family kept their distance, fearing contamination by association. For many it was a punishment worse than death, for death at least promised the hope of heaven. Excommunication closed even that final door. Yet even this punishment paled in comparison to the fate of heretics. Heresy was not seen as mere error, it was infection, a disease that threatened the very soul of Christendom. And so, punishments for heresy grew into some of the most bizarre and terrifying spectacles of the medieval world. Trials were conducted with solemn ceremony, inquisitors questioning suspects with relentless precision, extracting confessions through interrogation, coercion, and at times torture. Those who repented might be sentenced to lifelong penance, wearing crosses sewn into their clothing, fasting, or living in confinement. But those who refused to recant faced the fire. Burning at the stake became the ultimate punishment for heretics, a ritual as symbolic as it was cruel. Fire, in the medieval imagination, was both purifier and destroyer. To burn the heretic was to purge their sin and to cleanse the community of their corruption. Crowds gathered to watch, hymns were sometimes sung, and the condemned, bound to the stake, became both spectacle and sermon. Their cries mingled with the crackling of wood, their smoke rose like an offering, and the fire consumed body and doctrine alike. To modern eyes it was monstrous. To medieval faith it was necessity, the salvation of many demanded the destruction of one. But the Church's punishments were not confined to heretics. Blasphemers, those who cursed God or profaned the sacraments, faced grotesque symbolic penalties. In some towns, a man caught swearing God's name in vain might have his tongue pierced with a hot iron or cut out entirely, the very organ of sin removed. In other places he was forced to kneel barefoot in the churchyard, tongue clamped in wooden stocks, while neighbors laughed or prayed. The lesson was clear: to misuse God's name was to risk losing the power of speech altogether. Even more theatrical were the punishments designed to mirror sin. A man who mocked the church with gestures might be forced to parade naked, mimicking the gestures in shame before all. A woman who profaned holy days by working might be compelled to labor in public on Sundays, stripped of dignity while others feasted. Punishment became liturgy turned inside out, a grotesque parody of the sacred. Perhaps most haunting of all were the rituals of damnation. Chroniclers describe ceremonies in which condemned criminals were symbolically handed to the devil. A priest, standing before the congregation, would denounce the offender, reciting formulas that cast their soul into hell. Sometimes the punishment was staged with props: black candles extinguished one by one, bells tolled in mourning, and curses intoned with terrifying gravity. The condemned, alive but already damned, stood surrounded by ritual that declared them dead to God. Such ceremonies left a mark not only on the sinner but on the community, a chilling reminder that salvation could be stripped away as easily as a cloak. It is tempting to see these religious punishments as nothing but cruelty. And indeed they often inflicted terrible suffering. Yet they also reveal something profound about the medieval mind. To medieval Christians, the soul was eternal, and thus the greatest punishment was not pain of flesh but peril of spirit. Better to endure fire now than fire everlasting. Better to crawl in sackcloth for a year than to burn in hell for eternity. Punishments, however bizarre, were believed to be medicine, bitter draughts meant to heal the soul and preserve the community's bond with God. And in this light, even the strangest penalties take on grim coherence. Pilgrimage as punishment forced the sinner into exile but offered the chance of redemption. Public penance humiliated the offender but reconciled them with heaven. Excommunication terrified not only the sinner but all who watched, reinforcing the absolute necessity of faith. Burning at the stake, as horrifying as it was, stood as a sermon of fire, warning all that belief was not negotiable. The judgments of God as rendered by men may strike us now as bizarre, unjust, or monstrous. Yet to those who lived within the medieval world, they were the ultimate truth. In their eyes, justice was not about fairness but about salvation. The body could be shamed, scarred, or destroyed, but the soul, if cleansed, might yet live forever. And so, they built their punishments not only upon the scaffold and the square but upon the altar, the reliquary, and the endless shadow of eternity. In the medieval imagination, justice was not merely a human affair. Kings, judges, and magistrates might pass sentences, but the ultimate authority rested with God. And when evidence was uncertain, when witnesses were silent, or when truth seemed hidden, it was to God that men turned for judgment. Thus arose the ordeal, a ritualized punishment that was also a trial, a performance designed to let heaven itself reveal the truth. These ordeals were among the strangest punishments of the age, for they blended law, faith, and torture into one terrifying spectacle. The ordeal of hot iron was perhaps the most dramatic. The accused, whether of theft, perjury, or some darker crime, was brought before the gathered crowd, the church often looming in the background. A length of iron, sometimes a simple rod, sometimes a heavy bar, was heated in the fire until it glowed red. The accused was then ordered to pick it up and carry it for a set number of paces, or to hold it in his bare hand for a fixed count. The iron hissed as fingers closed around it, flesh seared, and the smell of burning skin filled the air. Yet the ordeal did not end there. Afterward, the wound was bound and sealed, left untouched for several days. Then, in solemn ceremony, it was unwrapped before witnesses. If the burn festered, if the skin was foul and infected, the accused was declared guilty. If it appeared to heal cleanly, he was judged innocent, his flesh miraculously preserved by God. To us, it seems barbaric, even absurd, but to the medieval mind the logic was clear. The Almighty Himself would not allow an innocent man to suffer corruption. In this way, divine justice and human justice merged into one blistering ritual of pain. No less fearsome was the ordeal of hot water. In this trial, a great cauldron was prepared, water brought to a furious boil. At the bottom of the vessel lay a stone or iron ring. The accused was ordered to plunge his hand into the boiling water and retrieve the object. Flesh bubbled, blisters rose, screams echoed. Like the ordeal of iron, the wound was bound and inspected days later. Clean healing meant innocence, festering wounds meant guilt. Some variations were harsher still. The accused might be ordered to reach elbow deep into the water, ensuring greater damage and greater drama. The ordeal was not only a test of guilt but a test of faith, for only the innocent, protected by God, could escape such horror unscathed. Equally common was the ordeal of cold water, a ritual that seems at first glance almost merciful, but in truth concealed its own terror. The accused was bound, often with ropes around chest and waist, and lowered into a body of water, a river, a lake, or even a holy font. The logic was inverted. Water, seen as pure and sacred, would reject the guilty. Thus, if the accused floated, it meant rejection by the element, a sign of guilt. If he sank, it meant innocence, but it also meant drowning unless helpers pulled him out in time. To be thrown into cold water was to be trapped between two dooms: guilty if you floated, dead if you did not. This ordeal was particularly used against women accused of witchcraft, and countless terrified souls sank into rivers as neighbors looked on, convinced that the water itself had spoken. Most theatrical of all, however, was the ordeal of combat, the trial by battle. Here, violence itself became the judge, and the clash of swords or the struggle of fists determined guilt or innocence. In cases where evidence was lacking, two parties could demand combat, each swearing that God would give victory to the righteous. Sometimes champions were appointed to fight in place of the disputants. At other times, accuser and accused fought one another directly. Nobles fought on horseback with lances, while commoners might be armed with clubs or staves in a pit. The combat was not sport, it was brutal, often to the death. Yet it carried with it a strange dignity, for victory was not seen as mere strength but as divine judgment. God would not allow the guilty to prevail, or so it was believed. In some cases, if one fighter yielded and confessed, the battle ended, guilt acknowledged by surrender. In others, the beaten man's death was the verdict itself. To modern eyes, it was barbarism disguised as justice. To medieval men, it was justice revealed through the hand of God. Ordeals were not limited to iron, water, or combat. Some were even stranger. In one ritual, the accused was forced to walk blindfolded over a field of red-hot plowshares, his bare feet stepping upon glowing metal. If he emerged unscathed, he was innocent. In another, a man was made to swallow a piece of dry bread and cheese, swearing his innocence. If he choked, it was proof of guilt. If he swallowed cleanly, God had spoken for him. These ordeals of the morsel were less bloody but no less terrifying, for a dry throat or nervous cough could doom a man as surely as fire. Underlying all of these rituals was faith, not in the fairness of men but in the direct intervention of God. The ordeal was prayer made flesh, a cry for heaven to reveal what men could not know. Priests often presided, blessing the fire, the water, the bread, invoking God's judgment upon the accused. The crowd, gathered in tense silence, believed they were not watching torture but revelation. To them, the screams of the burned or the thrashing of the drowning were not cruelty but testimony, the body speaking truth under the eye of the Almighty. And yet, the ordeal was never free from manipulation. Judges and priests, aware of the ritual's power, sometimes used it to enforce verdicts already decided. A sympathetic priest might cool the water slightly or shorten the ordeal, ensuring the accused emerged unscathed. A hostile judge might order the iron heated longer, guaranteeing burns. In this way, divine judgment could be steered by human hands, and the ordeal became both a test of faith and a tool of politics. By the 13th century, the ordeal began to fall into decline. The Church, once its great supporter, grew uneasy with the presumption that God could be compelled to reveal truth on demand. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council forbade clergy from participating in ordeals, a decree that struck at their very legitimacy. Without the blessing of priests, the rituals lost their sacred weight, and secular courts gradually abandoned them in favor of written evidence, testimony, and juries. But the memory of the ordeal lingered, etched into chronicles and folklore. For centuries, people whispered of men walking unscathed through fire, of women sinking in rivers as proof of innocence, of battles fought where God himself chose the victor. To us, the ordeal stands as one of the most bizarre punishments of the medieval world, a blend of superstition, faith, and cruelty. Yet it was also deeply logical within its own context. In a society where evidence was scarce, literacy rare, and trust fragile, the ordeal offered certainty, terrible, searing certainty. It told people that justice was not random, that heaven itself watched, and that no lie could escape divine fire or water. Whether true or false, the belief gave order to a world where truth was often hidden in shadows. The ordeal reminds us that medieval punishments were not only about bodies but about belief. Pain was not merely pain, it was proof, testimony, revelation. And in the crackle of fire, the hiss of boiling water, the splash of a drowning body, or the clash of swords, medieval people believed they heard the voice of God. In medieval society, loyalty was more than virtue, it was survival. To betray a lord, a king, or the very fabric of feudal society was to threaten not only the individual ruler but the fragile web of order that held the land together. And for those guilty of treason, justice was not merely punishment, it was spectacle, ritual, and eradication. The law for treason was elaborate, terrifying, and intended to communicate a single, indelible message. Betrayal is the ultimate crime, and the consequences will be total, visible, and unforgettable. The most infamous punishment for high treason in England was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a process both torturous and ritualized. The condemned man would first be hanged by the neck, but not to death, only to the point of near unconsciousness. Then he would be disemboweled, his entrails removed while still alive, often burned before his eyes. Next came beheading, the executioner slicing off the head with grim precision, and finally, the body would be cut into 4 quarters. Each quarter was then displayed publicly, nailed to gates, towers, or bridges as warning to all who might contemplate similar betrayal. The punishment was total, designed to obliterate both life and reputation, leaving behind a shattered corpse that spoke in multiple locations of the fate of treason. The process itself was carefully orchestrated to terrorize. Crowds gathered, sometimes numbering in the thousands, to witness each stage. Priests might offer absolution, while the condemned's family and peers looked on in horror. Pain was only part of the punishment. The primary aim was moral and political, to transform the body into a message, to warn all who saw it that loyalty to the crown was non-negotiable. The multiple stages ensured that death itself was prolonged, that agony was measured, and that spectators could fully absorb the consequences. In France, a particularly grotesque punishment for traitors involved breaking on the wheel, but with variations designed to prolong life and suffering. Limbs were shattered and intertwined with the spokes of a giant wheel, often elevated on a high pole so that birds, sun, and rain could act upon the body for days. Some victims were left alive for hours, sometimes days, before final death claimed them. The sheer duration of the agony transformed the execution into ritualized horror, a living testament to the crown's power over life and law. Scotland, too, had its own terrifying punishments for traitors. Those guilty of plotting against the king might be thrown from cliffs, strangled publicly, or burned alive. Sometimes traitors were sewn into sacks with live animals, dogs, snakes, or even monkeys, and thrown into rivers, a method designed not only to kill but to degrade utterly, leaving no dignity behind. In each case, the spectacle was essential. The body of the traitor became a warning etched into the landscape itself. Cliffs, rivers, and towers became memorials to both treason and punishment. The logic of treason punishments extended beyond death to obliterate memory. Heads displayed on spikes, quarters nailed to city gates, or bodies left to rot in public squares were all designed to erase identity. To betray one's lord was not simply to die, it was to be forgotten, erased from honor and history, your flesh scattered so that even in death you could not claim dignity. Chroniclers of the time often described the sight in grim detail, noting how children ran past the dismembered limbs of traitors, learning lessons of loyalty by force of horror. Yet the punishment for treason was not only physical, it was profoundly symbolic. The act of dismemberment represented the tearing apart of allegiance, the destruction of the social and political bond between ruler and subject. Hanging, drawing, and quartering dramatized this principle. The traitor's body, once unified, was divided into pieces, scattered across the land, a visual metaphor of fractured loyalty. Fire and steel became instruments of moral communication as much as instruments of death. Even lesser forms of betrayal inspired bizarre punishments. Spies, informers, or men who betrayed their comrades might be paraded through streets in chains, their heads shaved, and forced to wear signs proclaiming their offense. In some towns, traitors were forced to walk barefoot through public markets while carrying heavy burdens, symbolic weights representing the moral and political consequences of their actions. Some were required to perform humiliating tasks, such as cleaning streets or working in servitude for those they had betrayed, ensuring that shame accompanied punishment for life. Women convicted of treason faced distinct, often equally cruel punishments. Queens or noblewomen who conspired against kings might be imprisoned for life in remote castles or convents, stripped of status, sometimes forced into starvation or chains. In rare cases, they faced execution by burning or beheading, their deaths meant to serve both as punishment and as public moral lesson. The gendered variation in punishments reflected medieval beliefs about the role of women in maintaining, or disrupting, social and political order. Treason punishments also intersected with religious ritual. Before execution, traitors were often compelled to confess their sins publicly, pray for absolution, or partake in the last rites. Executioners would not act in isolation. Priests might bless the instruments of death, turning torture into both civic and sacred spectacle. The medieval mind intertwined politics, morality, and faith so completely that the execution of a traitor was at once legal, ritual, and theological. The display of body parts from executed traitors became an enduring feature of the landscape. London Bridge, Tyburn, city gates, and castle walls were covered with spikes and posts bearing severed heads and quarters, warning all who entered or departed. Some victims' limbs were placed in neighboring counties, so that the warning of treason stretched across miles, a network of fear and moral instruction. The living saw it daily, learning that betrayal invited not only death but obliteration, and that loyalty was enforced through terror as much as law. What makes the punishments for treason most remarkable is their combination of theatricality, cruelty, and symbolism. They were never simple executions. They were dramas staged with precision, agony timed and measured, bodies displayed with intention, rituals observed to the letter. Pain, terror, humiliation, and annihilation were fused into a single narrative of authority. The medieval world understood that treason threatened the foundation of society itself, and so the response had to be absolute. Total destruction of the offender, visible to all, unforgettable in its horror. And yet, even in the most grotesque executions, there was a perverse logic. By making punishment public, ritualized, and symbolic, society maintained order. Kings communicated authority, neighbors absorbed moral lessons. The very landscape became a living testament to loyalty. To betray the crown was not merely to die, it was to become a cautionary tale, an object lesson etched in flesh, blood, and memory. In this way, medieval punishments for treason were the ultimate blend of spectacle and morality, horror and education, brutality and meaning. To witness such a punishment, whether hanging, drawing and quartering, burning or dismemberment, was to confront the power of law and king alike. The crowd, as much participant as observer, became part of the ritual, ensuring that fear, awe and memory spread beyond the individual victim. Treason punishments were lessons for the living as well as penalties for the dead, moral statements carved into the public consciousness. In short, the bizarre, gruesome, and meticulous punishments for betrayal encapsulated the medieval obsession with control, obedience, and the vivid demonstration of authority. Not all medieval punishments were designed to kill, maim, or terrify. Many were aimed at correcting minor offenses, restoring social order, or simply amusing the public at the expense of those who transgressed everyday norms. For petty thieves, habitual liars, drunken brawlers, and other minor offenders, justice often took bizarre, theatrical forms. While these punishments were rarely fatal, they could be humiliating, uncomfortable, and psychologically scarring, revealing the medieval mind's fascination with shame, symbolism, and public spectacle. One of the most common punishments for minor crime was the cucking stool, a close cousin to the ducking stool reserved for women. Unlike the punishments for treason or heresy, The cucking stool was used mostly for disorderly women and tavern brawlers. The offender was strapped into a chair and lowered into the nearest river, pond, or cesspool, often multiple times. Unlike more serious crimes where drowning or boiling might be involved, this punishment relied primarily on humiliation and discomfort. Villagers would gather eagerly, jeering, laughing, and sometimes pelting the offender with mud or refuse, turning the punishment into an elaborate performance. The cucking stool was more than just punishment, it was a social corrective, designed to restore the offender to obedience through shame. Another curious device was the shrew's fiddle or neck violin, a wooden apparatus used to punish quarrelsome women and disruptive men. It was essentially a rigid plank with holes at each end for the head and hands, locking the person in place for hours or even a full day. The offender could neither eat nor move freely, forced to sit or stand in uncomfortable positions while the townspeople gawked. Sometimes the punished were paraded through streets, their plight amplified by the clatter of wooden shoes and jeers of neighbors. The shrew's fiddle was a blend of restraint, spectacle, and physical discomfort, making minor offenses painfully visible. In some towns, petty thieves were subjected to branding. A small symbol or letter burned onto the skin marked them as a thief or swindler. Though less gruesome than the punishments for murder or treason, branding carried a lifetime of shame. The mark was a permanent reminder to both the criminal and the community of transgression and social rules. Children, apprentices, and neighbors would know the offender's crime at a glance, reinforcing social norms without resorting to lethal measures. Minor offenders could also be forced to wear ridiculous clothing or symbols of shame. A habitual liar might be dressed in a fool's cap, with bells sewn into the garment so that every movement produced a jingle. Drunkards could be made to wear large wooden clogs or carry exaggerated bottles of ale while walking through the marketplace. The visual absurdity was part of the lesson. The offender's crime, however minor, became a public spectacle, a way of turning misbehavior into entertainment and instruction simultaneously. In some towns, offenders were punished by being paraded with signs declaring their crime. Shoplifters or debtors might be forced to wear placards reading "I steal" or "I lie," hung around their necks as they moved through crowded streets. This form of punishment relied entirely on public shame and social pressure. While it did not harm the body, it could ruin reputations, disrupt trade, and isolate the offender socially. The medieval mind understood that minor transgressions, if ignored, could escalate. Humiliation, though strange or even humorous, was a tool of preventive justice. Other petty punishments were interactive and inventive. In some German towns, offenders were forced to ride backward on donkeys, sometimes through the streets, while holding the animal's tail. The physical awkwardness, combined with public mockery, left the offender thoroughly embarrassed. A dishonest baker might have loaves tied to his neck and be marched through the village square, ensuring everyone knew of his deceit. Even the simplest offenses could be transformed into performances of social morality, teaching the community a lesson while punishing the wrongdoer. For small-time thieves or those caught stealing produce or livestock, towns sometimes resorted to dunking or whipping rituals that were highly controlled. The offender might be dipped in a pond repeatedly, or lightly whipped in public, with emphasis on spectacle rather than true injury. In some cases, an offender might be forced to publicly apologize or bow to victims, a ritual that reinforced social hierarchy and reminded both criminal and onlookers of the consequences of misbehavior. Even children were not exempt from bizarre corrections. Misbehavior in schools, from stealing pencils to arguing with teachers, often led to public reprimand, corporal punishment, or the use of wooden implements such as birch rods. In some monasteries and cathedral schools, young offenders were made to kneel on stones for hours, a painful yet non-lethal method of discipline. Such punishments were intended to instill obedience and conformity, impressing upon the young that rules were not optional and that deviation invited discomfort, ridicule, or embarrassment. The creativity of minor punishments extended to animals in some cases, illustrating the medieval obsession with social order. Misbehaving pigs, goats, or even dogs were occasionally subjected to symbolic punishments similar to human offenders. Paraded in chains, forced to wear signs, or publicly punished for disrupting the peace. While it may seem absurd, the logic was consistent. All disruption of social harmony, human or animal, needed correction, often in ways visible to the community. Medieval humor often intersected with law in these punishments. A drunkard might be forced to carry a beer barrel or bottle around town, a visual reminder of the folly of intoxication. A lying merchant might be made to sing his lies aloud in public, transforming dishonesty into spectacle. These punishments blurred the line between discipline, ridicule, and entertainment, reinforcing social norms while amusing the public. What might seem whimsical to modern eyes was deeply serious in context. The offender was both corrected and warned that misbehavior would not go unnoticed. Even the tools of punishment reflected symbolic thought. Wooden stocks, cucking stools, or shrews fiddles were designed not merely to restrain but to emphasize exposure, embarrassment, and the social consequences of wrongdoing. Pain was minimal compared to torture, but the psychological and reputational impact could linger for years. The medieval mind believed that public shaming was a way of maintaining communal morality without invoking deadly force. Yet the creativity of these punishments often made them memorable, strange, and uniquely theatrical. The takeaway from these minor, bizarre punishments is that medieval justice was never purely utilitarian. Even the smallest offenses were opportunities to communicate social values, to warn the community, and to reinforce hierarchy. Humiliation, awkwardness, and discomfort were carefully calibrated to teach obedience while entertaining spectators. The petty criminal became a living moral lesson, the town square a stage, and the audience both participant and witness. While they may appear bizarre, whimsical, or even cruel by modern standards, these punishments reveal the medieval mind's deep investment in visibility, symbolism, and moral order. In a world without widespread literacy or centralized policing, the spectacle of correction was an essential tool of governance. Each rod, stool, and backward donkey ride conveyed a simple but potent message. Society watched, morality demanded compliance, and even small misdeeds would be met with consequences crafted for maximum visibility and effect. In the medieval world, work was not merely a means of survival, it was a social contract. A baker who sold sour bread, a tailor who stitched poorly, or a brewer who watered down ale threatened not only the reputation of their craft but the trust of the entire community. Guilds, local authorities, and towns took such offenses seriously, and they devised punishments that were both inventive and public, blending humiliation, ritual, and correction. To transgress in the workshop was to invite the full force of social and legal sanction, often in bizarre and memorable ways. Bakers were frequent targets of occupational punishment. Bread, the staple of daily life, was a matter of survival, and to sell substandard loaves was considered a grave offense. Punishments could be humiliating, literal, and public. A baker caught with spoiled bread might be forced to wear a sign around his neck reading, "I cheat my customers," while being paraded through the market square. In some towns, authorities made the baker carry his own bad loaves through the streets, sometimes forcing him to throw them into a pond or burn them in front of the gathered crowd. The act served multiple purposes: correction of the offender, restoration of consumer confidence, and communal reinforcement of honesty. Tailors, too, were subject to unusual penalties. A tailor who stitched clothing poorly or failed to deliver work on time might be tied to a post and exposed to public ridicule. In some cases, guilds required the offender to sew or mend in public as a form of penance, ensuring that the community witnessed the labor and the correction. Other variations included wearing garments that were intentionally mismatched, patched, or backward, a literal representation of the mistakes made in craftsmanship. The humiliation was immediate, visible, and tied symbolically to the quality of work itself. Brewers and vintners faced punishments that were both practical and theatrical. Selling weak or adulterated ale could result in fines, but also public shaming. Some towns forced brewers to pour their inferior brew into the street while neighbors jeered, an act that simultaneously punished, warned, and cleansed the community. Occasionally, the brewer might be dunked in a vat of water or subjected to other ritual humiliations, ensuring that the price of deception was both physical and social. These punishments reinforced trust in essential commodities while entertaining the population with dramatic displays of justice. Other tradesmen experienced punishments tied directly to the tools of their craft. Blacksmiths who damaged goods or misused fire might be forced to display broken weapons or tools in public, their errors literally nailed to the town gate for all to see. Carpenters who built unsafe structures could be required to assist in dismantling the faulty work, sometimes under the watchful eye of townspeople or guild inspectors. The punishment was thus both corrective and exemplary. The offender's mistake became a public lesson, ensuring that quality was maintained across the community. For minor crimes within workshops, guilds developed rituals of public penance that were almost ceremonial in nature. Apprentices who lied, stole materials, or failed to meet standards might be forced to kneel for hours in front of the master craftsman while reciting confessions aloud. These acts were uncomfortable and humiliating, but they also reinforced hierarchy, discipline, and apprenticeship as a moral as well as practical endeavor. Guild halls and workshops thus became arenas where morality, craft, and justice intertwined. Some towns devised punishments that were particularly theatrical. Tailors might be forced to parade through the streets wearing garments made entirely of scraps, their errors literally displayed on their bodies. Bakers might be dunked repeatedly into the river for repeated offenses, not to injure but to humiliate. Even shoemakers who produced defective shoes could face public scrutiny, compelled to wear the faulty footwear through the town square as a symbol of their failure. The creativity of these punishments highlights the medieval mind's fascination with visible, memorable lessons. Humiliation served as the teacher and the public square as the classroom. It was not just human labor that could be punished. Animals associated with trades were occasionally included in occupational corrections. Horses, mules, or oxen used in transport or construction might be publicly shamed for failure, their owners held accountable. In some cases, animals were made to participate in the ritual, dressed in symbolic attire or paraded with their masters. Such punishments reinforced the idea that skill, honesty, and diligence were collective responsibilities, extending beyond the individual to the tools and beasts of labor. Interestingly, these punishments often blended humor with discipline. Medieval society seemed to recognize that ridicule could be as effective as pain in enforcing obedience. A brewer paraded with his empty barrels, a baker dunked in a pond, a tailor wearing a patchwork garment. Each scenario turned work errors into public theater. Citizens laughed, learned, and internalized moral lessons simultaneously. By transforming mistakes into spectacles, communities maintained trust in essential goods, preserved guild standards, and underscored social cohesion without resorting to fatal measures. The psychological impact of these occupational punishments should not be underestimated. For the tradesman, embarrassment in front of peers and neighbors could be more painful than any whip. Guilds relied on public recognition, honor, and shame to regulate behavior. The fear of ridicule, the potential of being paraded or mocked, ensured that mistakes were corrected quickly and that standards remained high. Medieval towns understood that reputation was currency, and that minor punishments had long-term social consequences. Even small errors were treated symbolically. A faulty loaf, a crooked seam, or a weak barrel could be transformed into a moral statement. Tools, products, and even the craftsman's body became part of the lesson. Punishments were imaginative, tailored to the offense, and designed to be remembered. They reflected the medieval belief that justice was not only about punishment but about restoring balance, maintaining order, and educating the public. These occupational punishments highlight the medieval integration of morality, community, and labor. They were not merely acts of cruelty or whimsy, they were structured, meaningful, and symbolic. The offender's work, reputation, and dignity became instruments through which society taught itself lessons. Bizarre though they may seem now, these penalties were deeply effective in reinforcing honesty, skill, and communal trust. In sum, justice in the medieval workshop was inventive, public, and moralistic. It extended beyond punishment to social instruction, blending humiliation, ritual, and spectacle. Every loaf of bread, every seam, and every barrel carried not only material value but moral weight. By punishing failures in creative, memorable ways, medieval society preserved order, ensured quality, and wove lessons into the fabric of everyday life. In this world, the bizarre was not senseless. It was pedagogy, performance, and protection all rolled into one. In medieval society, morality was inseparable from law. Sin was not merely a private failing. It threatened social cohesion, spiritual order, and the honor of families and communities. Crimes such as adultery, blasphemy, indecency, and fornication were treated with severity, often punished in ways that combined humiliation, public spectacle, and ritualized correction. The aim was not just to chastise the offender but to instruct the community, reinforcing moral codes through drama, fear, and ridicule. In this context, the punishment of moral transgressions became a vivid expression of societal values, a theater in which shame and obedience were inseparable. Adultery was considered one of the gravest moral offenses, undermining family, inheritance, and social trust. Both men and women faced punishments, but gender often dictated the severity and spectacle of the penalty. Women, in particular, were subjected to public humiliation. They could be paraded through the streets wearing signs proclaiming their misdeeds, forced to ride backward on donkeys, or made to wear distinctive garments marking their shame. In some towns, adulterous women were tied to the stocks or pillory while villagers threw mud, rotten vegetables, or dung, ensuring that the humiliation was both sensory and public. Men, though sometimes treated less harshly, were still subject to ridicule, public confession, or fines that reinforced the seriousness of betrayal. Blasphemy and sacrilege were punished with a combination of physical and public measures. Swearing God's name in vain or desecrating sacred objects could result in severe, often bizarre penalties. Offenders might have their tongues pierced or tied, reflecting the medieval belief that the organ of sin should be restrained or punished. Public confessions in church or before the town were common, accompanied by kneeling, prostration, or wearing signs of shame. The goal was to transform private irreverence into public spectacle, ensuring that both offender and audience internalized the gravity of moral transgression. Indecency and public lewdness were treated with similar creativity. Individuals caught in acts of fornication or lewd behavior could be subjected to public parades, often in humiliating attire or positions. One notable punishment involved carrying a large wooden codpiece or phallic symbol through the town, symbolizing the sin while exposing the offender to ridicule. Such punishments were designed not only to shame the guilty but to warn others against similar misbehavior. The combination of absurdity, humiliation, and visibility made moral transgression costly, socially and psychologically. Communities also devised punishments that emphasized symbolic correction over physical harm. For instance, offenders might be forced to perform penance tasks such as walking barefoot to the church, carrying heavy crosses, or participating in rituals of public apology. These acts reinforced humility and submission, blending morality with public performance. In some villages, couples caught in illicit affairs were compelled to perform labor for the community, such as mending fences, tilling fields, or cleaning streets, ensuring that their wrongdoing was balanced by service and visibility. Guilds and town authorities sometimes enforced morality through occupational sanctions. Workers guilty of moral transgressions could be excluded from workshops, publicly reprimanded, or forced to attend moral lectures in front of peers. For women, moral failings often resulted in social ostracism, confinement, or public rituals designed to restore family and community honor. In this way, morality and labor were intertwined. Personal behavior had consequences not only for the individual but for communal trust and economic life. Punishments for moral crimes often relied on imagination, ritual, and spectacle. For example, the brank or scold's bridle, a metal mask with a gag, was used to punish women deemed quarrelsome or sexually inappropriate. The device restricted speech, sometimes included a protruding iron tongue, and was paraded publicly, turning verbal or moral transgression into visible correction. Similarly, men or women guilty of public drunkenness or sexual misbehavior might be tied to a cart or forced to wander the streets carrying symbols of their sin. The emphasis was always on exposure, humiliation, and communal education. Religious authorities played a central role in these punishments. Priests often conducted blessings, public confessions, or ceremonial penances, linking moral correction to spiritual restoration. In some towns, offenders were required to wear penitential clothing, coarse sackcloth, chains, or marked garments, while performing acts of public contrition. These rituals transformed the punishment into a moral lesson. Sin disrupted not only social order but divine order, and correction required both visibility and ritualized submission. Even seemingly minor moral infractions could inspire elaborate punishments. Gossipers, liars, and petty thieves were sometimes punished in ways that mocked their behavior. A gossip might be paraded with a bell on her head, signaling her words to all, while a liar could be forced to repeat confessions aloud in public. Such punishments combined humor and shame, ensuring that the offender learned the lesson while the community internalized the moral boundaries. Medieval society understood that ridicule, when structured and symbolic, could be as effective as pain in maintaining order. Gender played a significant role in the enforcement of moral law. Women were often punished more publicly and severely for sexual or verbal transgressions, reflecting societal fears of female influence, honor, and propriety. Men were subject to fines, public confession, or symbolic humiliation, but women frequently faced enduring stigma, ritualized exposure, and social exclusion. The disparity highlights the intersection of morality, power, and gender in medieval justice, revealing both the creativity and cruelty of punishments designed to maintain order. Moral punishments also extended to festivals and communal gatherings. Offenders might be publicly shamed during fairs, religious festivals, or markets, ensuring maximum visibility and social impact. In some cases, mock trials or theatrical performances were staged, with the offender playing a role that dramatized their misdeed. These events combined entertainment, moral instruction, and public correction, turning punishment into a form of civic pedagogy. What emerges from these practices is a vision of medieval society in which morality, law, and public spectacle were inseparable. Sin was not private. Wrongdoing required correction in view of the community. Punishments for moral crimes were designed to shame, humiliate, educate, and restore balance, often using creativity, ritual, and symbolism to maximize impact. The emphasis on visibility and spectacle ensured that lessons were memorable, that social norms were reinforced, and that both offender and observer internalized the consequences of misbehavior. Even today, the punishments for moral crimes offer insight into a world where private behavior carried public consequences. The bizarre, theatrical, and often humiliating measures reflect a society deeply concerned with order, reputation, and spiritual well-being. Exposure, ridicule, and ritualized correction were tools of governance, morality, and pedagogy, demonstrating that in the medieval mind, sin demanded response, and public spectacle was the most effective medium for delivering justice. In sum, the enforcement of morality in medieval times relied on creativity, ritual, and social observation. Public humiliation, symbolic devices, parades, and penitential labor turned private wrongdoing into collective lessons. By punishing the body and orchestrating spectacle, medieval society sought to correct behavior, preserve social cohesion, and enforce moral order. These bizarre yet highly structured punishments reveal a worldview in which sin, shame, and social stability were inextricably intertwined. In the tightly knit communities of medieval Europe, debt was not simply a personal misfortune, it was a threat to social cohesion. Lending and borrowing were vital to trade, agriculture, and daily survival, and failure to repay debts could destabilize towns, guilds, and families. Medieval authorities treated economic offenses seriously, devising punishments that were often elaborate, public, and designed to shame as much as to coerce repayment. Unlike today's impersonal legal processes, medieval punishments for debt and financial crimes were highly visible, often blending humiliation, ritual, and creativity. Debtors who failed to pay could find themselves confined in debtors' prisons, which were less about incarceration for crime than about social pressure and humiliation. In some towns, prisoners were chained in dark cells, forced to endure cold and damp, and left to rely on charity for food. But more unusual punishments went beyond mere confinement. Some debtors were placed in stocks or pillories, often near marketplaces or church doors, where passers-by could mock, jeer, and sometimes throw rotten food. This public exposure served as both coercion and example, reminding the community that financial obligations were binding under threat of shame. Merchants and tradesmen guilty of cheating, failing to pay taxes, or misappropriating funds were often subjected to similarly theatrical punishments. A merchant who falsified accounts might be paraded through town with ledgers hanging from his neck, symbolizing the dishonesty of his bookkeeping. In some cases, officials required offenders to stand in public with a bell or drum, loudly announcing their offenses while the townspeople laughed or jeered. The display was a visual and auditory lesson in honesty, ensuring that the community internalized both the offense and its consequences. For repeated or severe financial transgressions, more humiliating measures were used. In some villages, debtors were bound in chains or ropes and dragged through the streets by officials, a ritual that emphasized both punishment and spectacle. Others were forced to carry heavy stones or other burdens through town, literal weights representing moral and economic responsibility. The goal was not only to punish but to illustrate the principle that debts were serious obligations, with consequences that extended beyond the ledger to the body, reputation, and social standing of the offender. A particularly bizarre form of punishment involved the cucking, or dunking of dishonest merchants in water. Those who shortchanged customers or failed to deliver goods could be strapped to a chair or stool and submerged in a pond, river, or even a town fountain. The act of immersion symbolized purification, washing away dishonesty and restoring communal order. At the same time, the humiliation reinforced social norms, ensuring that other merchants and townspeople understood the consequences of unethical behavior. The combination of physical discomfort, public ridicule, and ritualized cleansing made this a potent, memorable punishment. In some regions, guilds enforced economic fairness through creative penalties. A blacksmith or carpenter who stole materials or failed to complete contracts on time might be required to work in public under supervision, repairing tools or structures as a demonstration of skill, honesty, and submission. Sometimes the offender was made to wear signs declaring their crime, parading through marketplaces or guild halls to show contrition and restore trust. These punishments relied on visibility and shame rather than pain, emphasizing moral and social correction alongside restitution. Debtors who fled or resisted repayment could face the bizarre practice of debt hanging. While not lethal, this punishment involved suspending the debtor by ropes or chains for a period, exposing them to the elements and leaving them publicly visible. Crowds would gather to mock or scold the offender, turning debt collection into a civic spectacle. The medieval mind equated visibility with accountability. Hiding from financial responsibility was as socially unacceptable as theft, and public exposure ensured that social and moral obligations were enforced. Some towns also employed imaginative mechanical devices for financial punishment. Debtors could be locked into iron cages or crampons for extended periods, their confinement both a warning and an inconvenience. In other cases, towns designed symbolic punishments. A debtor's empty purse might be tied around his neck or displayed in the market to mark him as untrustworthy. Such symbolic devices transformed abstract financial wrongdoing into a visible, tangible lesson for all. Fines, while common, were often supplemented by humiliation. Offenders might be required to pay restitution in public, sometimes performing physical tasks like shoveling refuse, cleaning streets, or laboring in fields while spectators observed. In some cases, the debtor was mock-crowned or dressed in rags, emphasizing the social cost of financial mismanagement. Even when physical pain was minimal, the psychological and social impact could be severe, influencing behavior for years and serving as a deterrent to others. Interestingly, the punishment of debtors highlights the medieval concern with community enforcement. Unlike modern banking systems, medieval towns relied on social surveillance and public ritual to maintain economic trust. Punishment was not only about rectifying a personal wrong but about reinforcing communal stability. The spectacle of humiliation, burden-bearing, or public labor educated townspeople, restored confidence in trade, and emphasized that moral, economic, and social obligations were inseparable. Debt punishment was also gendered. Women who mismanaged family finances, failed to return dowries, or were accused of cheating in markets faced public shaming, sometimes in cucking stools, stocks, or parades, while men were often subjected to heavier physical burdens or public labor. Both sexes, however, were vulnerable to social stigma, illustrating the intersection of economy, morality, and visibility in medieval justice. Through these punishments, the medieval world transformed economic misbehavior into lessons of accountability, trust, and morality. They relied on spectacle, shame, and symbolic labor to enforce obligations, turning abstract debts into physical, visible experiences. While bizarre to modern eyes, these measures were effective. They educated communities, restored social cohesion, and reinforced ethical standards in commerce and daily life. Even today, the punishments for debt and financial crime provide insight into a society where survival, trade, and social order were intertwined. Shame, spectacle, and symbolic action were the tools of enforcement, ensuring that dishonesty carried consequences that were not only legal but social and moral. The bizarre, public, and ritualized methods demonstrate that in medieval towns, economic responsibility was inseparable from visibility, community, and honor. In sum, medieval punishments for debt and financial crimes were a blend of humiliation, ritual, and practical correction. Chains, dunkings, public parades, labor, and symbolic devices transformed abstract obligations into tangible consequences. Offenders learned, observers internalized, and communities maintained trust. The creativity, spectacle, and morality of these punishments reflect a society in which social order, economic reliability, and public visibility were inseparable. In this strange, dramatic, and often harsh system, justice was as much performance as penalty, teaching lessons that extended far beyond the offender's personal misdeeds. In medieval society, animals and the land were not merely resources. They were vital components of survival, wealth, and communal well-being. Livestock provided food, labor, and status. Crops ensured sustenance. Forests, rivers, and pastures sustained villages and towns. To harm animals, steal livestock, or damage land was therefore more than a personal offense. It was an attack on the social and economic fabric of the community. Consequently, towns and guilds devised punishments that were imaginative, ritualized, and often bizarre, designed both to penalize offenders and educate the public about the sacredness of natural resources. One of the most common crimes involved the theft or mistreatment of livestock. A man who stole a cow, pig, or sheep could be subjected to public humiliation and corporal punishment. In some villages, the offender would be tied to the animal he had stolen, paraded through town, and whipped lightly to demonstrate the seriousness of the offense. Sometimes the criminal was forced to return the animal to its rightful owner while wearing a sign identifying his crime. This practice served multiple purposes: correcting the offender, warning others, and restoring faith in communal property. In a society reliant on livestock, the theft of even a single animal could threaten the livelihood of a family, making visible punishment both practical and symbolic. harming animals was met with similarly strange justice. Dogs, horses, or cattle that were injured or killed by negligence or cruelty prompted punitive measures against the offender. Offenders might be compelled to pay restitution with food, money, or livestock, but they could also face public shaming, such as parades through the marketplace while carrying the dead or injured animal as evidence of wrongdoing. In extreme cases, offenders were made to kneel, pray, or perform acts of penance before the community, blending morality, social accountability, and ritualized correction. Damage to crops and fields inspired equally theatrical punishments. A peasant who trampled another's wheat or allowed livestock to graze on forbidden land could be fined, but fines were often accompanied by public humiliation. Offenders might be required to repair the damaged fields, carrying tools and working under the watchful eyes of neighbors. In some towns, offenders were dressed in humiliating costumes symbolizing their transgression, or forced to march through the village, hands raised or bound, as a reminder to the community of the consequences of negligence or malice. Such measures reinforced the sacredness of agricultural labor and the interdependence of rural communities. The protection of forests, rivers, and common land also led to bizarre penalties. Cutting trees without permission, poaching fish, or disturbing wildlife could result in fines, forced labor, or public shaming. In some regions, offenders were required to stand in stocks near the damaged area, holding signs or tools symbolizing their crime. Sometimes they were made to carry branches, logs, or fish through the village, a visible act of restitution and a reminder that harm to natural resources had social as well as legal consequences. These punishments reinforced communal responsibility, making it clear that the protection of nature was both a civic and moral obligation. Guilds and local authorities often orchestrated punishments that were as imaginative as they were instructive. A man who poisoned a neighbor's livestock might be forced to parade through the marketplace, carrying a dead animal or wearing a symbol of his crime. Children, villagers, and fellow tradesmen would watch, learning the importance of honesty and care in dealings with animals and property. The punishments served as both correction and theater, ensuring that moral lessons were delivered publicly and memorably. Some offenses against animals involved symbolic justice. For example, a man who neglected his horses might be tied behind a cart and led through town, mirroring the suffering his animals endured. Offenders guilty of cruelty to dogs or poultry could be made to kneel in front of the animal or community while performing acts of penance, emphasizing the interconnectedness of humans and creatures in medieval thought. By making punishment visible, ritualized, and morally resonant, communities reinforced ethical treatment of animals while deterring potential offenders. Nature itself could become the stage for bizarre correction. Offenders who damaged irrigation systems, dikes, or communal wells might be forced to work under the sun, repairing the infrastructure while carrying signs identifying their crime. Villagers would observe, both to learn and to ensure accountability. In some cases, offenders were required to perform labor in silence, reflecting the gravity of disrupting natural and communal balance. The combination of physical exertion, public scrutiny, and moral instruction created a holistic form of justice in which the offender's body, labor, and visibility were all part of the lesson. Punishments often combined education with humiliation. A man who killed a goose or stole eggs could be forced to wear feathers or a bird mask while returning the stolen goods. Such bizarre measures were highly visual and memorable, embedding moral lessons in the minds of the community. The offender was reminded of the offense, observers were reminded of the law, and both were instructed on proper behavior in the handling of animals. Humor and spectacle were leveraged to teach, ensuring that mistakes were corrected while preventing repetition. In some villages, ritualized punishments for harm to animals included symbolic trials. Offenders could be tried in mock courts presided over by local elders or guild members, forced to answer for their actions in front of witnesses. Sentences often involved public restitution, labor, or symbolic acts representing the crime, such as walking barefoot through pastures or carrying a live animal to the owner. These rituals blended theater, morality, and justice, turning what might have been an abstract offense into a concrete, memorable lesson. Even minor transgressions received creative attention. A child who killed a frog or a bird might be required to apologize publicly, perform a small labor task, or participate in a mock ritual of restitution. By transforming offense into education and spectacle, medieval communities ensured that respect for life, property, and the land was instilled from a young age. The bizarre, theatrical measures were less about cruelty than about embedding moral principles into the collective consciousness. Through these punishments, medieval communities emphasized the interconnectedness of human and natural life. Animals, land, and water were not resources to exploit arbitrarily, they were part of a shared moral and economic order. Punishments, whether public humiliation, forced labor, symbolic restitution, or imaginative ritual, reinforced ethical behavior, communal trust, and social cohesion. The bizarre methods, parades, masks, symbols, labor under scrutiny, ensured that lessons were memorable, visually striking, and morally resonant. Ultimately, the punishments for crimes against animals and nature reveal a society deeply concerned with balance, morality, and collective responsibility. Offenders were corrected physically, socially, and psychologically, communities were educated, resources were protected, and moral norms were reinforced. The medieval imagination turned crime into spectacle, mistakes into pedagogy, and justice into theater, demonstrating a worldview in which human behavior, animals, and the environment were tightly interwoven. Even today, these strange punishments provide insight into a society where survival, ethics, and spectacle were inseparable. By blending ritual, humiliation, and education, medieval authorities ensured that crimes against animals and nature were taken seriously, teaching both offenders and observers that harm to the living world had consequences visible to all. Through chains, parades, labor, masks, and public ritual, the medieval mind transformed moral and ecological responsibility into a tangible, unforgettable lesson. In medieval Europe, religion was not simply a matter of private belief. It was the foundation of law, morality, and social cohesion. To commit heresy, practice witchcraft, or desecrate sacred objects was to challenge the very order of society. Religious crimes were treated with a severity and creativity that rivaled the punishments for treason or violent crime. Authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, designed penalties that combined fear, spectacle, and ritualized terror to enforce obedience, instruct the faithful, and publicly demonstrate the power of divine law. The punishment of religious crimes was as much about reinforcing social and spiritual authority as it was about retribution. Heresy, the most feared religious crime, was punished with a blend of ritualized execution and public shaming. A heretic might be required to publicly confess, wear penitential clothing, and stand in stocks before being led to the execution site. The infamous method of execution for unrepentant heretics was burning at the stake, a punishment designed to cleanse the soul through fire while terrifying the witnesses. Victims were often tied to wooden stakes, sometimes with the pyre surrounding them, and the flames consumed the body in a horrifyingly slow spectacle. The fire symbolized both divine wrath and purification, turning the execution into a powerful moral and religious lesson for the community. Witchcraft, often associated with women, was punished in equally bizarre and terrifying ways. Accused witches could be subjected to ordeals by water, where they were tied and thrown into rivers or ponds to see if they would sink or float, a test whose outcome could determine life or death. If a witch floated, she was deemed guilty and often executed, typically by hanging or burning. If she sank and survived, she risked drowning. Other methods included piercing, branding, or confinement in iron cages, often accompanied by public humiliation. The punishments were intended to dramatize the danger of consorting with the devil and to create a spectacle of fear that reinforced religious authority. Sacrilege, or the desecration of sacred objects, inspired similarly inventive punishments. Offenders who stole from churches, destroyed holy relics, or desecrated altars could be forced to wear chains, carry heavy crosses, or perform public penance in full view of the community. Some were made to parade through the streets while carrying symbols of their crime, often barefoot and dressed in coarse sackcloth. The act of public humiliation reinforced the sacredness of religious objects and reminded observers of the consequences of disrespecting divine law. The mechanisms of punishment were often theatrical, combining physical suffering with psychological terror. Heretics and witches were sometimes paraded through towns before execution, their faces marked with charcoal or wearing masks symbolizing their sins. Bells or drums might announce their approach, drawing crowds to witness the consequences of defying religious authority. In some cases, execution sites were chosen for visibility, such as hilltops, bridges, or town squares, ensuring that the moral and spiritual lesson reached as many people as possible. Inquisitions added another layer of ritualized terror. Those accused of heresy were interrogated, often under threat of torture, to extract confession. The inquisitors' methods ranged from stretching and whipping to the use of devices designed to inflict extreme discomfort without immediate death. The process itself was a performance, a ritualized negotiation between human authority, divine law, and public morality. Once convicted, the sentence, often death by fire, served as both punishment and spectacle, a public demonstration of the dangers of spiritual defiance. Witchcraft trials were particularly prone to bizarre and grotesque punishments. Accused witches could be subjected to searches for witch marks, pins, or other evidence of consorting with demons. Confessions were often extracted under duress, sometimes by forcing the accused to swallow substances that induced pain or hallucination. Public executions followed, often involving strangulation followed by burning, a combination of physical terror and symbolic purification. Communities gathered to witness, ensuring that fear and moral instruction spread beyond the immediate victim. Even minor religious offenses inspired imaginative punishments. Blasphemers, those who spoke disrespectfully of the divine, might be forced to stand barefoot in church for hours, wear penitential garments, or carry objects symbolizing their offense. Mock trials or parades were organized to dramatize the consequences, combining ridicule, instruction, and moral correction. The line between ritual, performance, and punishment was often blurred, reflecting a worldview in which sin, social order, and divine authority were inseparable. Gender played a significant role in the enforcement of religious law. Women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft, reflecting fears about female influence, sexuality, and the unknown. Punishments for women could involve public shaming, forced labor, imprisonment, and execution, often designed to heighten fear and spectacle. Men accused of heresy or sacrilege faced similar punishments but were more likely to be subjected to intellectual interrogation, fines, or corporal punishment that emphasized moral and civic responsibility. The disparity illustrates how medieval society intertwined gender, fear, and religious control. Religious crimes were also punished symbolically through ritualized acts of public atonement. Pilgrimages, fasting, carrying crosses, or reciting confessions aloud were common forms of penance, often imposed in addition to or instead of corporal punishment. These acts were visible, did not always cause lasting physical harm, and reinforced communal moral standards. By making the offender's repentance public, authorities ensured that spiritual transgression was addressed both privately and communally. The spectacle of execution and punishment served multiple purposes. It communicated the authority of the church, demonstrated the power of the state, and warned the populace that defiance carried extreme consequences. Crowds gathered to witness heretics burned, witches drowned, and sacrilegious offenders paraded, absorbing moral, spiritual, and civic lessons. Punishment was as much about teaching and reinforcing social norms as it was about inflicting pain or exacting retribution. Even minor acts of impiety were treated with ritualized creativity. Offenders might be forced to wear pointed hats symbolizing the devil, walk through towns holding candles or crosses, or publicly confess their sins while kneeling in humiliation. These punishments were bizarre by modern standards, yet they reflected a coherent moral and social philosophy. Sin, particularly against the divine, required correction that was visible, memorable, and instructive. Through these measures, medieval authorities maintained both spiritual and social order. Heresy, witchcraft, and sacrilege were not only crimes against individuals or property but offenses against the moral fabric of society itself. By combining physical punishment, public spectacle, ritualized penance, and imaginative symbolism, communities reinforced obedience, instilled fear, and educated citizens on the importance of faith, reverence, and conformity. In sum, the punishment of religious crimes in medieval times exemplifies the integration of justice, morality, and spectacle. Fire, chains, public penance, and ritualized humiliation were tools designed to correct behavior, instruct the community, and demonstrate divine authority. The bizarre, terrifying, and theatrical measures ensured that spiritual and social norms were maintained, showing that in medieval Europe, religious transgression demanded visible, unforgettable, and symbolic consequences. Rebellion and mob crimes represented one of the greatest threats to medieval society. Unlike individual offenses, these acts challenged not only property or morality but the authority of lords, kings, and communal structures. Medieval rulers, from village elders to monarchs, recognized the power of spectacle and public punishment to deter collective defiance. Punishments for riots, uprisings, or organized resistance were elaborate, theatrical, and designed to instill fear while reinforcing hierarchical control. These measures combined ritual, humiliation, and sometimes extreme physical suffering, turning the punishment of offenders into a communal lesson on loyalty, obedience, and the dangers of insurrection. A common response to rebellion was the public execution of ringleaders, often accompanied by extraordinary spectacle. Leaders of uprisings were displayed in stocks or pillories before execution, sometimes for days, while townspeople and soldiers were assembled to witness their fate. Hanging, beheading, or breaking on the wheel were among the most severe penalties, but they were rarely performed in private. The visibility of punishment served as both retribution and deterrent, emphasizing that challenging authority invited not only death but public humiliation. Crowds were drawn into the ritual, watching, commenting, and internalizing the moral lesson that rebellion could never be tolerated. In some regions, entire villages or communities implicated in rioting faced collective punishment. Authorities might seize property, impose heavy fines, or conscript offenders into labor for the crown or the lord. In addition to these practical measures, symbolic punishments were employed. Offending communities were sometimes forced to participate in public rituals of penance, marching in silence or carrying banners declaring loyalty to the sovereign. This theatrical approach reinforced social cohesion, demonstrating that collective responsibility extended beyond the immediate perpetrators and warning entire populations against defiance. Mob crimes often led to bizarre and imaginative public humiliation. Rioters could be forced to walk barefoot through town carrying weapons or objects used in their crimes, signaling both their guilt and submission. In some cases, chains or stocks were used to restrain multiple offenders simultaneously, parading them through marketplaces or streets where spectators could taunt or throw refuse. The combination of discomfort, visibility, and ridicule was central to the medieval understanding of justice. The punishment of collective crime required that the lesson reach the largest audience possible. Rebellion against feudal lords or monarchs sometimes resulted in particularly grotesque penalties. Those convicted of sedition could be drawn and quartered, a punishment designed to maximize both physical suffering and public shock. Limbs were separated and displayed in prominent locations, market squares, city gates, and crossroads, to serve as warnings. In other instances, traitors' heads were mounted on spikes or city walls, ensuring that their fate was visible to anyone considering similar defiance. These gruesome spectacles were both deterrent and symbolic. Authority demanded recognition, and disobedience was met with the most extreme visibility. Even minor acts of collective defiance, such as unlawful gatherings or drunken riots, were met with imaginative and humiliating measures. Offenders might be placed in stocks in full view of the community, subjected to taunting, or forced to march while wearing signs describing their offenses. Some towns employed unique devices such as cages, yokes, or iron collars to restrain offenders while parading them through streets. These methods emphasized the absurdity and danger of mob behavior, transforming punishment into spectacle, moral lesson, and public theater simultaneously. Medieval authorities also used symbolic punishments to reinforce the power of law and hierarchy. A town that resisted a lord's rule might be required to perform public labor, repairing roads, bridges, or fortifications under supervision. Offenders were often dressed in shameful garments, forced to wear signs of guilt, or made to carry symbols of rebellion as a visible reminder of their disobedience. The focus was less on immediate suffering than on creating a lasting impression, turning punishment into a civic drama that communicated the consequences of disorder to the entire populace. Punishments for rebellion often incorporated ritualized and performative elements. Offenders might be paraded in mock trials, forced to recite confessions, or kneel in public for hours while officials delivered lectures on loyalty, obedience, and morality. By combining ritual, physical discomfort, and social humiliation, authorities ensured that lessons were deeply internalized. The theatricality of punishment was crucial. Medieval rulers understood that the spectacle reinforced fear, obedience, and respect for law far more effectively than private correction. Crowds played an essential role in the enforcement of these punishments. Spectators were both witnesses and participants, engaging in jeering, mockery, and sometimes pelting offenders with refuse. This collective engagement amplified the impact of punishment, transforming private wrongdoing or rebellion into a communal morality lesson. Social cohesion, authority, and fear were simultaneously reinforced. The punishment became not only a personal correction but a public reinforcement of the societal order. Gender and rank influenced the nature of punishments for rebellion. While male leaders often faced severe physical penalties, women associated with riots could be subjected to public humiliation, forced labor, or symbolic ritual punishments such as wearing distinctive clothing or carrying objects representing their involvement. Nobles guilty of sedition might receive harsher, highly visible punishments such as imprisonment in iron cages, public parades, or execution designed for maximum spectacle. This stratification reflected the medieval preoccupation with hierarchy, status, and the symbolic power of justice as a tool of social control. Even minor insurrections were often treated with creative measures designed to shame offenders. A small group of rioters could be forced to perform public penance in churches or marketplaces, kneeling, carrying crosses, or reciting confessions aloud. Parading through town with banners announcing their crime, wearing signs, or enduring physical discomfort made their wrongdoing visible, reinforcing social order. By blending humiliation, labor, and ritualized visibility, authorities turned punishment into a multifaceted lesson for both offenders and the community. The punishments for rebellion and mob crimes highlight the medieval understanding of collective responsibility. Offenses were not treated solely as individual failings but as threats to social, political, and moral order. Authority relied on visibility, spectacle, and ritualized terror to restore obedience, deter future defiance, and teach communal lessons. Bizarre, theatrical, and highly structured punishments transformed crime into performance, ensuring that the consequences of rebellion were both memorable and morally instructive. Ultimately, medieval responses to rebellion combined fear, spectacle, and morality into a single system of correction. Public executions, parades, symbolic labor, and ritualized humiliation were tools designed to communicate authority, enforce obedience, and reinforce hierarchy. The theatrical and bizarre aspects of punishment ensured that lessons were deeply internalized, deterring collective disobedience while educating the populace. In a world where social cohesion depended on the recognition of authority, these imaginative punishments transformed law enforcement into a form of public theater, making rebellion a high-risk endeavor with consequences visible to all. Treason in medieval Europe was considered the ultimate crime, a betrayal not only of political authority but of societal order itself. Kings, lords, and governing councils viewed acts of rebellion, conspiracy, or betrayal as threats so severe that ordinary punishment was deemed insufficient. Medieval authorities developed punishments for treason that were both gruesome and theatrical, blending physical suffering with symbolic gestures designed to terrify, humiliate, and instruct the population. The goal was twofold: to punish the offender and to reinforce the authority of rulers in a highly visible, unforgettable manner. The most notorious method of punishing traitors was drawing and quartering, a punishment reserved for those convicted of high treason. This brutal procedure involved dragging the offender through the streets, often tied to a horse, to the site of execution. The public display began before any death occurred, serving as a spectacle of humiliation and warning. Once at the execution site, the condemned was hanged, but only until near death, then disemboweled, beheaded, and finally divided into 4 parts. These quarters were typically displayed at prominent locations, such as city gates or crossroads, turning the body into a permanent warning. The grotesque visibility emphasized both the severity of betrayal and the omnipresence of authority. Treasonous nobles or officials often faced similar, yet more elaborate, punishments. Depending on rank, they might be subjected to imprisonment in iron cages that were hung from public buildings or towers, forcing them to endure humiliation and exposure for months. Crowds would gather below to observe, hurl insults, or even throw refuse, ensuring that the noble's disgrace was visible to all. This combination of physical suffering, social humiliation, and public engagement transformed punishment into a dramatic lesson, teaching both elites and commoners the costs of disloyalty. Other punishments were deeply symbolic. Some traitors were required to wear distinctive garments, such as coats of shame emblazoned with symbols of betrayal, while being paraded through towns. In some cases, chains or collars inscribed with their crimes were attached, making their guilt visible and enduring. The theatricality emphasized that treason was not just a private crime but a public offense against the social and divine order. Authorities relied on spectacle, moral instruction, and social engagement to maintain obedience and deter future conspiracies. Boiling or burning alive, though less common, was also employed for particularly heinous acts of treason. Kings and lords understood that the combination of pain, public visibility, and ritualized terror created lasting psychological impact. Executions were carefully staged, sometimes including sermons or proclamations explaining the crime and punishment, transforming the event into a moral lesson for both elite and common populations. The public nature of these punishments underscored that betrayal could not be concealed and that authority demanded recognition, obedience, and fear. Some punishments were designed to combine humiliation with physical suffering. Traitors could be exposed on scaffolds for hours or days, sometimes with heads shaved or tongues pierced, before any execution took place. Others were forced to march in chains, carry heavy weights, or perform menial labor as a prelude to the ultimate penalty. Every aspect of the punishment, from the journey to the site of execution, the devices used to the audience's participation, was carefully choreographed to maximize shame, fear, and deterrence. Medieval rulers understood that treason was as much a crime against perception and authority as against law or person. The role of public spectators in punishing treason cannot be understated. Crowds were integral to the process, witnessing, participating, and internalizing lessons about loyalty and obedience. Spectators hurled insults, mocked the condemned, and absorbed the message that betrayal invited extreme consequences. The spectacle reinforced authority, created communal memory of punishment, and encouraged conformity. In many towns, the display of traitors' bodies at gates or crossroads ensured that fear extended beyond the execution site, leaving a permanent mark on the community's consciousness. Gender and social rank affected the treatment of traitors, though extreme punishment was common for all. Male conspirators often faced dismemberment, hanging, or public torture. Women accused of treason could be subjected to public humiliation, forced labor, and symbolic ritual punishments, such as parades with signs describing their betrayal, shaving of heads, or confinement in public cages. Nobles faced elaborate execution rituals designed to dramatize the fall from status, while commoners endured simpler, but no less terrifying forms of punishment. The stratification underscored the symbolic as well as practical dimensions of medieval justice. Even minor acts of betrayal or conspiracy inspired imaginative punishments. Officials or peasants caught conspiring against local lords might be forced to perform public labor, carry banners describing their crime, or wear distinctive costumes marking them as traitors. Mock trials, parades, and ritualized public confessions were employed to dramatize their wrongdoing, ensuring that social memory of the offense and its consequences remained vivid. The medieval mind linked visibility, shame, and correction as inseparable tools of governance. Punishments for treason were also moral and religious in dimension. Kings and clergy framed executions as necessary not only to maintain law and order but also to preserve divine justice. Burning, hanging, and quartering were interpreted as purifying acts, cleansing both the body and the social order. Public confessions, sermons, and ritualized penance reinforced the idea that betrayal was a moral as well as political offense, ensuring that the punishment resonated beyond physical suffering. The medieval emphasis on visibility, spectacle, and ritualized terror created punishments that were both memorable and instructive. The combination of humiliation, physical pain, symbolic gestures, and audience participation ensured that lessons extended to witnesses as much as to the condemned. Authority was reinforced, fear was instilled, and societal cohesion maintained. Treason became not just a crime but a performance, where punishment served as theater, pedagogy, and deterrence simultaneously. In sum, medieval punishments for treason exemplify the era's unique blend of brutality, morality, and spectacle. Drawing and quartering, public exposure, chains, parades, ritualized humiliation, and symbolic labor transformed betrayal into a moral and civic lesson. By combining terror, theatricality, and visibility, authorities ensured that loyalty, obedience, and social order were preserved. The bizarre, extreme, and highly structured nature of these punishments demonstrates that in medieval Europe, treason demanded consequences that were both unforgettable and publicly instructive, leaving a lasting impression on the social imagination. As we reach the end of our journey through the bizarre punishments of medieval times, it becomes clear that these methods of justice were more than mere cruelty. They were reflections of a society governed by a complex web of morality, law, religion, and social order. The punishments were carefully constructed, theatrical, and symbolic, designed to communicate moral lessons to offenders and communities alike. From public humiliation to physical pain, from ritualized labor to grotesque executions, medieval punishments transformed crime into performance, turning punishment into a tool for social cohesion, deterrence, and moral instruction. They were as imaginative as they were severe, demonstrating the medieval mind's capacity to combine fear, spectacle, and pedagogy in a single act. Medieval authorities recognized that justice could not be abstract or private. It had to be visible, communal, and memorable. Punishments for theft, debt, rebellion, heresy, treason, and even moral failings were performed in public spaces, often in front of large audiences who participated through observation, ridicule, or active engagement. Visibility ensured accountability, reinforced social norms, and communicated the consequences of transgression to all. The public nature of punishment transformed individual crime into collective education, embedding moral lessons into the consciousness of entire communities. The creativity of medieval punishments reflects the diverse threats perceived by society. A peasant stealing a loaf of bread, a noble conspiring against a king, or a heretic challenging the church all represented breaches of trust, morality, or divine order. Each offense demanded a response tailored not only to the crime but also to the social and symbolic hierarchy it affected. Chains, stocks, cucking stools, iron collars, public parades, and executions were employed strategically to punish, humiliate, and instruct, demonstrating that the medieval justice system was as much about teaching as it was about retribution. Humiliation was a constant feature, often paired with physical discomfort or pain. Offenders were forced to parade through towns, wear signs marking their crimes, endure ridicule from crowds, and perform public labor or ritualized penance. These punishments were designed to attack the offender's reputation, social standing, and psychological state as effectively as their body. Medieval authorities understood that shame could be as powerful as torture, embedding lessons in memory and discouraging others from committing similar transgressions. The symbolic dimension of punishment was equally striking. Many devices and rituals represented abstract moral or social principles. The stocks, pillories, and cucking stools transformed private sin into public spectacle. Burning at the stake symbolized both divine purification and social deterrence. Drawing and quartering visualized the dismemberment of authority and betrayal. Even less severe punishments, like carrying banners or performing ritual labor, conveyed symbolic meaning about responsibility, restitution, and communal harmony. In each case, punishment became a narrative, a story enacted in front of witnesses, teaching lessons that extended beyond the individual offender. Religious authority was deeply entwined with punishment, reflecting the medieval belief that law, morality, and divine order were inseparable. Crimes against God, the church, or sacred objects invited ritualized, highly visible, and often terrifying correction. Heretics and witches faced public confessions, trials, and executions that dramatized the consequences of spiritual transgression. The intertwining of fear, morality, and spectacle ensured that punishment was not merely physical but spiritual, reinforcing the authority of religion alongside secular governance. The social function of punishment extended beyond immediate correction. Public executions, humiliation, and parades created communal memory, ensuring that moral lessons persisted long after the event. Communities internalized norms and boundaries, learning through observation the limits of acceptable behavior. Authority was reinforced not only by coercion but also by collective participation, making the justice system a shared, performative experience. Medieval punishments were as much theater as law, ensuring that lessons were memorable, emotionally impactful, and socially instructive. Despite their cruelty and bizarre nature, these punishments were consistent with the values and priorities of medieval society. Survival, social cohesion, morality, and divine order were paramount. Acts that threatened these pillars, whether theft, rebellion, moral failing, or heresy, demanded proportionate and highly visible responses. Physical pain, humiliation, labor, and symbolic gestures were tools to restore balance, educate the community, and reinforce hierarchy. The extremity of the methods reflected the perceived severity of the threats rather than mere sadism, illustrating the medieval worldview in which justice and spectacle were inseparable. Gender, rank, and status played crucial roles in determining punishment. Women, particularly for moral or spiritual crimes, often faced humiliation and ritualized exposure, while men might endure heavier physical punishment or execution. Nobles and officials sometimes experienced elaborate, theatrical penalties designed to display the fall from power, whereas commoners endured simpler, yet no less memorable, forms of correction. These distinctions reinforced social hierarchies while ensuring that lessons reached the appropriate audiences, blending justice, pedagogy, and social symbolism. The legacy of these punishments extends beyond the medieval period, offering insight into the human relationship with crime, authority, and social order. While modern justice systems emphasize privacy, rehabilitation, and proportionate sentencing, the medieval approach prioritized visibility, memory, and moral instruction. The bizarre, imaginative, and often theatrical measures remind us that law can be performative, that punishment can educate as well as deter, and that social cohesion often depends on shared recognition of both transgression and consequence. In reflecting on these practices, one sees a world in which crime, punishment, and society were intertwined in deeply symbolic ways. The offender's body, labor, and reputation became instruments of teaching, the community became both audience and participant, and morality was inseparable from law and ritual. Medieval punishments, strange and horrifying to modern eyes, were coherent expressions of a worldview in which social order, divine law, and communal responsibility demanded highly visible, imaginative, and memorable correction. Ultimately, the story of medieval punishments reveals a society striving to maintain balance in a world fraught with physical danger, moral uncertainty, and social complexity. By transforming transgression into spectacle, pain into pedagogy, and humiliation into moral instruction, medieval authorities created a system of justice that was as performative as it was punitive. While the methods may seem bizarre or brutal today, they were rooted in a coherent philosophy. Crime threatened the fabric of society, and punishment, visible, imaginative, and communal, was the necessary remedy. These lessons remind modern readers that justice has always been about more than punishment alone. In medieval times, it was about communication, memory, social cohesion, and moral instruction. The bizarre punishments, the theatrical spectacles, and the ritualized humiliations were not merely acts of cruelty but sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining order and educating communities. In this way, the medieval world provides a powerful testament to the creativity, intensity, and symbolic richness of human approaches to justice. As we close the exploration of these strange, terrifying, and often grotesque punishments, one cannot help but reflect on the resilience, fear, and ingenuity that shaped medieval law. Every pillory, stake, stock, and public parade was a story, a lesson, and a spectacle, reminding society of the cost of transgression and the centrality of obedience, morality, and communal responsibility. In the bizarre theater of medieval justice, every punishment told a story, every spectacle taught a lesson, and every act of correction preserved the delicate balance of a world in which law, morality, and social order were inseparably entwined.